The handcuffs clicked shut in front of 30 witnesses, and nobody moved. Emily Carter went down hard on one knee against the cold pavement outside Redstone Medical Center, her scrub still stained with another patient's blood, her hands pulled behind her back before she could finish the sentence she was speaking. The officer who cuffed her didn't look at her face. He looked at the crowd gathered at the ER entrance and shrugged like he'd just issued a parking ticket. "Just a nurse," he said. "Relax, people." Emily didn't scream, didn't cry. She tilted her head slightly toward the second officer and said, very quietly, "You still have time to stop this." He laughed. 47 minutes later, 3 military vehicles would seal every exit of the city block, and nobody would be laughing anymore. If this story already has your pulse going, stay with me. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Hit like, drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning had started the way most mornings did at Redstone Medical Center, badly. Emily clocked in at 6:42, 18 minutes before her shift technically began, because that was how she operated. Not out of eagerness or ambition. She'd learned, years before she ever set foot in a civilian hospital, that 18 minutes was the difference between knowing what you were walking into and getting blindsided. She grabbed the overnight handoff notes from the charge nurse's station, skimmed them standing up, and was already halfway down the corridor toward Bay 4 when Diane Okafor, the night shift charge nurse, caught up to her. "You look like you didn't sleep," Diane said. "I slept fine." "You look like you didn't sleep," Diane repeated, because she was the kind of person who said what she meant twice if once didn't take. Emily tucked the notes under her arm. Bay 4 had a 41-year-old post-op bleed last night. Stabilized around 2 a.m. Dr. Hargrove signed off. "I'm going to check on him anyway." Diane didn't argue. She'd stopped arguing with Emily about things like that 8 months ago, around the same time she'd stopped asking why Emily always positioned herself with her back to the wall during staff meetings, or why she could get an IV into a rolling vein under pressure in under 4 seconds, while other nurses who'd been doing this twice as long sometimes took 3 tries. Some people were just built different. Diane had decided early on that Emily Carter fell into that category, and she'd adjusted accordingly. What Diane didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Emily had been doing this specific kind of work long before she'd ever worn scrubs. The post-op patient in Bay 4, a man named Roy Alderman, was sitting up when Emily came in, which was more than she'd expected. He was 63, heavy-set, with the kind of face that suggested he'd spent most of his adult life outdoors and hadn't much enjoyed it. He had a wife in the chair beside him, who stood up immediately when Emily entered, the way people do when they've been waiting for someone competent to show up. "He's been restless since 4, the wife said. "I kept asking the overnight nurse to come back, and she kept saying he was stable." "He is stable." Emily checked his chart, then his drainage site, then his pulse, all in a sequence that looked almost choreographed. But restless is worth paying attention to. She adjusted the drain angle, noted the output color, asked Roy 2 questions about his pain, and had already formed an opinion about why he'd had a rough night before she'd finished writing in the chart. She flagged it for the attending. She did not wait to be asked. This was the job. She did it without drama, without the performance that some of her colleagues fell into, the elaborate bedside manner that was really just theater, the exaggerated empathy that exhausted everyone, including the patient. Emily was direct, she was precise, and she was genuinely effective. And if that sometimes read as cold to people who preferred the theater, that wasn't her problem to solve. She moved through the morning efficiently. 3 admissions, 2 discharges, a wound assessment that took longer than it should have because the attending was delayed, a difficult conversation with a family in the waiting room about what a care escalation actually meant in practical terms. Emily didn't soften it into meaninglessness. She told them the truth, plainly, and then she stayed with them for the minutes that followed because those minutes mattered more than the words did. By 10:15, she was back at the nurse's station, updating charts, when she noticed something that made her go still. Dr. Nolan Graves, the ER medical director, was standing at the far end of the corridor with 2 men she didn't recognize. Not patients, not families. They were wearing the particular kind of business casual that meant nothing specific but suggested everything. Slacks, no tie, the kind of jacket that costs more than it looks like it does. They weren't looking at charts or phones. They were looking at her. She didn't react. She finished her note entry, stood up, and went to check on a patient in Bay 7. Graves had been a problem for the better part of 4 months. Not in any single visible way. That was what made it complicated. He was the kind of administrator-physician hybrid who had enough clinical credibility to avoid scrutiny and enough institutional power to set the terms of every conversation. He'd taken issue with Emily the first time she'd escalated a case over his head because the attending he'd scheduled was impaired and she'd known it before she could prove it. He'd called it insubordination. She'd called it patient safety. The patient had survived a pulmonary crisis because Emily had made the call she made, and Graves had spent the months since engineering a slow, quiet campaign to isolate her. Bad schedules, ignored recommendations, the kind of professional erosion that leaves no fingerprints. Emily had documented everything. That was a habit she'd carried from a previous life. You documented everything, you kept copies in 2 places, and you never assumed that someone in authority was working in your interest. She was not wrong. At 10:53, one of the 2 strangers approached the nurse's station while the other stayed back near Graves. The one who came forward had a practiced smile that didn't reach anything above his cheekbones. "Emily Carter? That's me. We have some questions for you. Do you have a few minutes?" "I'm working. It'll be brief." She looked at him the way she'd learned to look at people who use the word brief as a social lubricant. "What kind of questions?" "Regarding a formal complaint filed against you this morning." She set down the chart she was holding, not because she was alarmed, because the chart deserved to be set down properly. "A complaint from whom?" "That's part of what we'd like to discuss." She said nothing for a moment. Around her, the ER continued. A gurney rattled past. Someone called out a medication order, the ambient noise of a functional emergency department doing its work. She was aware of 2 other nurses watching from a few feet away, doing the thing people do when they're pretending to look elsewhere. "All right," she said. They walked her toward a consult room near the administrative wing, and she went without argument, partly because argument at this stage was strategically pointless, and partly because she was already processing, already accounting for what this meant in the context of something larger she'd been tracking for weeks, something that had started with billing discrepancies in the trauma unit and had slowly, methodically led her somewhere much worse. She sat in this consult room. The 2 men sat across from her. Graves stood near the door. The complaint, as they described it, was spectacularly thin. A patient had apparently alleged that Emily had behaved aggressively during a care interaction 6 days prior. The patient's name they would not share. The nature of the aggression they described in terms so vague they were essentially meaningless. Emily listened to all of it with her hands folded on the table and her expression giving away approximately nothing. When they finished, she said, "I'd like to see the formal complaint in writing." "We're still in preliminary." "I'd like to see it in writing," she said again. Not louder, just more final. The man with the practiced smile exchanged a look with his colleague. Graves shifted his weight near the door. "Ms. Carter," the second man said, the one who'd barely spoken, "I want you to understand that the hospital takes these matters very seriously." "I do understand that," she said, "which is why I'd like the documentation." They didn't produce any. They wrapped up the meeting with language about next steps and pending review and the importance of cooperation. And Emily thanked them politely and walked out of the room with the same unhurried stride she'd walked in with and went directly back to her patients. She worked through lunch. She worked through an afternoon that included a pediatric asthma case, a broken arm repair, and a 40-minute standoff with an insurance approval line that ended the way those standoffs usually ended, with Emily having documented every step in enough detail that the insurer's position became untenable. She was precise. She was effective. She did the job. At 3:45, she sent a file. Not from the hospital's system. From a phone she kept in her locker, a separate number, a contact she hadn't needed to use in several months. The file contained a compressed set of documents, billing records, a set of flagged timestamps, photographs of physical records. She had no official reason to have photographed except that she'd been very careful and very patient, and a short summary memo that laid out, in flat declarative sentences, what she believed she had found and what she believed it meant. She did not explain the file in the message she sent with it. The person on the other end would understand. She put the phone back in her locker, closed it, and went to check on a sepsis patient in Bay 9 who was due for a reassessment. She was standing at the bedside, her back to the door, when she heard the commotion in the corridor. The sound of it was specific, not the ordinary noise of an ER, which she'd calibrated to intuitively, but something different. Shoes, multiple pairs, moving fast. A voice she didn't recognize, pitched high with the particular authority of someone performing authority rather than actually possessing it. She turned around. There were two officers in the doorway. Ashford PD, from the uniforms. One of them was already stepping into the room. "Emily Carter?" She set down the chart. "Yes. We need you to come with us." The patient in the bed, a 70-year-old man named Gerald, who'd arrived that morning with fever and confusion and had spent 4 hours frightened before Emily had taken time to explain each test to him in language that didn't make him more frightened, looked up at the officers and then at Emily with the expression of someone who understood that something was wrong without knowing what it was. "I'm in the middle of patient care," she said. "That's going to need to wait. It's going to need to wait about 6 minutes until I complete this assessment, and then I'll come with you." The first officer stepped fully into the room. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 26, with the tight shoulders of someone compensating for uncertainty with posture. "Ma'am, now." Gerald's hand moved slightly on the blanket. Emily noticed. She held up one finger to the officer, a gesture so small and so controlled that it somehow stopped him mid-step. And she looked at Gerald. "Your numbers look good," she said. "Dr. Takimura is going to come by in about 30 minutes. You're going to be okay." She meant it. She said it the way she said things she meant, which was without decoration. Gerald nodded. She walked toward the door. The second officer took her arm at the elbow. She did not tense. She did not pull back. She walked with him, her posture unchanged, her face composed. They moved through the corridor this way, and the corridor was occupied. Nurses, an attending, 2 orderlies, 3 patients who were ambulatory, and Diane, who was coming out of a supply room and stopped cold when she saw what was happening. "Emily." "I'm fine," Emily said. Her voice was even. It was always even. At the nurses' station, they stopped. A third officer had appeared. He had the manner of someone in charge, which in this case seemed to mean he spoke slightly louder than the others and occupied more physical space. He read from something on a tablet. A formal arrest notice. Charges she could see were centered on obstruction and falsification of medical records. She recognized the language. It had the specific texture of something constructed rather than discovered. "You have the right to remain silent." "I understand my rights," she said. "Then let's move." They walked her out. Through the ER waiting area where 40-odd people turned to watch. Through the automatic doors, into the cold Colorado air, down the 3 steps to the ambulance bay, where 2 police cruisers were parked at angles that blocked the immediate space. And it was there, in the ambulance bay, with the mountain air cutting through her scrubs and the faint sound of a dispatcher on one of the cruiser radios, that the lead officer applied the handcuffs. She went down on one knee because the motion was abrupt, not because she lost composure. She stayed there for a moment, both knees, hands behind her back, the pavement hard and cold. A hospital security guard was standing nearby, not doing anything, the way people do when they're trying to calculate whether intervention is worth the cost. Staff had followed to the doors. She could feel them watching. The officer who'd applied the cuffs stepped around in front of her and looked down. He was the oldest of the 3, 50-something, the kind of weight in his face that suggested he'd made decisions he hadn't examined closely. "Just a nurse," he said. It wasn't directed at her particularly. It was directed at the audience. She looked up at him. "You still have time to stop this," she said. The quiet in the ambulance bay stretched for a moment. Not a dramatic, cinematic quiet, just the ordinary pause of people who weren't sure what they'd just heard. Then the officer snorted and told the others to get her in the car. They didn't stop this. The holding area at Ashford PD's district station was functional and undistinguished. Painted block walls, a bench, fluorescent lighting calibrated to make everyone look slightly unwell. Emily sat on the bench in her scrubs, her wrists still cuffed in front of her now, and she thought about the files she'd sent. She thought about timing. She thought about the patient in Bay 9 and whether Gerald would remember what she'd said to him, and whether that would help. She asked twice to make a phone call. Both times she was told it would happen shortly. Shortly in her experience meant when it was convenient for whoever was telling her shortly. At some point, she'd lost precise track of time, which bothered her more than anything else that had happened that morning. The door to the holding area opened and a man in a suit came in. Not one of the men from the hospital, someone new. He had the particular quality of stillness that distinguished people who operated at certain levels of institutional authority. Not the performed stillness of someone trying to seem calm, but the real thing, the stillness of someone who didn't need to fill silence. "Miss Carter." He pulled a chair to the opposite side of the table that occupied the center of the room. "I'm going to need you to verify your identity using the protocol." She looked at him. "Who are you?" "Someone who received a file approximately 3 hours ago." He set a phone on the table, face down. "Please use the protocol." She considered him for another moment. Then she recited a 16-digit alphanumeric code, completely from memory, without hesitation. He typed something. He looked at whatever came back on the screen, and his expression moved in a way that was almost imperceptible. A slight tightening, a recalibration. "They arrested you," he said. He said it the way you say something you knew was coming but hoped wouldn't. "Yes." "When?" "Approximately 4 hours ago." He set the phone down, turned it over. The screen was visible now, and on it she could see, upside down but readable, the beginning of a response that had come back to whatever he'd queried. She couldn't read all of it. She caught 3 words in the header before he tilted the phone away. "Clearance level, active." "Has anyone from this department verified your identity?" he asked. "No." He was already on his feet. "That ends now." The door opened before he reached it, which meant someone had been listening, which meant this room was not as private as it appeared, which she had already suspected. Another man came in, older, the kind of military-adjacent posture that persists long after someone leaves service. He looked at Emily on the bench and then at the man in the suit, and then at a point somewhere between them where difficult facts tend to accumulate. "We've got a problem," the man in the suit said. "I know," the other man said. "A bigger one than the arrest." A pause. "How much bigger?" The man in the suit looked at Emily. Emily looked back at him. "The file she sent," he said. "I need you to read it." The second man took the phone. He read. The room was very quiet. Emily could hear distantly the sounds of the station, phones, movement, the ordinary noise of a place that processed human trouble all day without particularly solving it. She watched the second man's face as he read, and she saw the moment it landed. The specific moment when the scope of what the documents described resolved into something he could no longer account for with the explanations he'd arrived with. He looked up. He looked at Emily. "How long?" he said. 11 weeks, she said. He exhaled through his nose. It was the sound of someone adjusting to new terrain. "And you sent this 3 hours ago, before the arrest?" "Before I was taken out of the building, yes." "Why not sooner?" "Because 3 hours ago I had enough." She said it plainly. Not enough to suggest, enough to prove. He set the phone on the table. He looked at the man in the suit. Something passed between them. Not words, something shorter than words. The compressed communication of people who'd worked together long enough to not need the scaffolding. The man in the suit left the room. The second man sat down across from her. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, somewhere in the station, a door opened and shut. And then another one. And then she heard, faint but distinct, a sound she recognized in the way you recognize things that are stored somewhere below memory. The specific frequency of military radio traffic. Not civilian, not police band, military. The man across from her heard it too. He straightened almost involuntarily. "They're early," he said. He said it quietly, more to himself than to her. Emily said nothing. She sat with her hands on the table, her scrubs still marked with the morning's work, and she waited, with the patience of someone who had learned, in places that didn't appear on any map, that the right moment was worth waiting for. The radio traffic grew louder. Then came the sound of engines. Multiple. The particular heavy diesel sound that did not belong to police cruisers or ambulances or any vehicle in the ordinary inventory of an Ashford, Colorado Tuesday. The fluorescent light above the holding table hummed its indifferent hum, and through the small frosted window near the ceiling, Emily could see the shadows of vehicles moving into position on the street outside. Then a voice, close, clear, carrying the particular command register that cut through ambient noise without effort. "This is Lieutenant Commander Devlin Marsh, United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. I am requesting immediate access to this facility and the immediate release of the individual in your custody. A pause. This is not a request. The man sitting across from Emily pressed his lips together. He stood up. He looked at her one more time, and in his face was the complex expression of someone who had badly miscalculated the weight of what they were holding. I'll need your cuffs removed, he said. She held out her wrists. Outside, the station had gone to a particular kind of quiet. Not silence, but the compression of sound that happens when a room full of people simultaneously realizes they are no longer in charge of what happens next. Through the walls came the sounds of Lieutenant Commander Marsh issuing instructions that were not being argued with, and the distinct absence of the confrontational noise that would have suggested they were being resisted. The cuffs came off. Emily set her wrists on the table and looked at the marks they'd left. 8 hours. That was how long it had taken from the moment she'd sent the file to the moment military investigators were standing outside a police station in Ashford, Colorado, demanding her release. 8 hours was not long. 8 hours was, in fact, extraordinarily fast, which told her something about what the people she'd sent the file to had found when they'd looked at what she'd built. The door opened. Lieutenant Commander Marsh was not what most people pictured when they pictured military investigators. He was compact rather than imposing, somewhere in his mid-40s, with a face that looked like it had been arranged specifically to give nothing away. He came into the room and he looked at Emily with an expression that had no performance in it whatsoever. "Specialist Carter," he said. "I'm not Specialist Carter anymore," she said. "I've been a nurse for 3 years. You're going to need to be both for a little while longer." He set a folder on the table. It had markings on the cover that made the man who'd been sitting across from Emily take a visible step backward. "We need to talk about what's in your file, and then we need to talk about what's in ours." She looked at the folder, then at him. "All right," she said. Through the frosted window, the shadows of the military vehicles sat motionless and solid, blocking the street in both directions. Somewhere in the station, someone who hadn't known this morning that the day was going to end this way was making a phone call they'd hoped they would never have to make, reaching for a number kept in a place they thought was safe, trying to warn people who were already out of time. Emily Carter pressed her palms flat on the table. And the second phase of this began. The folder on the table between them was thin, maybe 30 pages, but Marsh handled it the way people handle things that weigh more than they look like they do. He didn't open it immediately. He pulled the chair out, sat down across from Emily, and took a moment to look at her the way a person looks at a situation they've been briefed on versus the situation actually in front of them. There was a gap between those two things, and he was adjusting to it in real time. "You look like you've had a rough morning," he said. "I've had rougher." "I know." He tapped the folder without opening it. "Kandahar 2019, the field station at Mirabad Valley. You want me to keep going, or do you believe me when I say I've read your file?" She didn't answer that. "What's in yours?" He opened it then, turned it to face her. The first page was a financial summary, columns of figures, dates, account numbers with the identifying digits redacted, routing information that had been flagged in red along the left margin. She looked at it without touching it. She'd seen similar documents in a different context, constructed differently, but the pattern was the same. "How much?" she said. "Over the period we've been able to reconstruct, roughly 14 months, somewhere between $8 and $11 million. The range is still wide because we haven't finished pulling the threads." He turned to the second page. "This started before you arrived at Redstone." "I know." "You knew that when you took the assignment." "I suspected it. I confirmed it in week 3. He nodded once. He wasn't writing anything down. He had the kind of memory, she suspected, that didn't require notes for conversations like this. The billing fraud is the visible layer. What we're looking at underneath it is a procurement scheme that runs through the hospital's trauma supply contracts, back through a shell company registered in Delaware, and into a set of accounts connected to individuals who are currently holding positions in both Ashford City Government and the Larimer County Sheriff's Office. Emily said nothing. She was watching him, and she was watching the door behind him, and she was aware, in the way she was always aware of such things, that there were at least 4 people in the immediate vicinity of this room who she had not yet accounted for. "What's Graves's role?" she said. Marsh's expression shifted. "Not much, but enough." "You got to Graves." "I got to the edge of Graves. I couldn't see the inside of it without access I didn't have." Graves is the mechanism, Marsh said. He controls which cases get coded how, which supplies get ordered from which vendors, and which incidents get reported or buried. He's been doing it carefully enough that the hospital's own compliance office has missed it for 2 years. He paused. He's also the one who filed the complaint against you this morning. She had suspected that. Suspecting something and having it confirmed are different experiences, and she allowed herself the small internal acknowledgement of the difference before moving on. The 2 men he brought to the consult room, both connected to the sheriff's office, plain clothes. They were there to assess how much you knew and whether the arrest would hold long enough to... He stopped. Long enough to what? He looked at her steadily. Long enough to give someone access to your locker. The air in the room changed. Not physically, just the quality of attention inside it. My locker was accessed, she said. Not a question. Between the time you were brought in and the time my people arrived at the hospital, yes. A hospital security supervisor named Trent Boyle used a master override. We have it on the internal camera system, which, notably, the people who ordered the access did not realize was backed up to an off-site server that Redstone's IT department set up 18 months ago and apparently never mentioned to hospital administration. He let that sit for a moment. They were looking for documentation, physical records, a phone. They didn't find a phone. No. What they found was a set of folders containing, as far as we can tell, routine nursing reference materials and a spare pair of compression socks. Emily said nothing. Where's the documentation you removed from the hospital? Marsh asked. She looked at him for a long moment, not stalling, assessing. There was a difference. I need to know who has authorization on this investigation at the federal level before I answer that. Fair. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced an identification card and a secondary document that he slid across the table. She read them. She read them the way she read things that mattered, which was thoroughly and without rushing. She slid them back. Assistant U.S. Attorney Nadia Forsyth out of Denver is the lead on the federal side, he said. She's been building a parallel case for 6 months. When your file came in, she called me. He picked up the credentials. We've been looking for the inside component, the person who could verify what the paper trail suggested. The paper trail doesn't suggest it. It demonstrates it. The invoicing irregularities alone, we know, but invoice irregularities are defenses. He leaned forward slightly. What we need, and what your file gives us the beginning of, is the direct link between the billing fraud and the individuals making the decisions. Right now we have the money moving. We need the hands that moved it. The fluorescent light hummed. Emily looked at the table surface between them, which was institutional laminate, scratched in the way things get scratched when people have been having difficult conversations across them for years. The documentation is secure, she said. I'll give you access to it on 2 conditions. He didn't look surprised. Go ahead. Every patient whose records were fraudulently coded gets reviewed and corrected. All of them, not a representative sample. That's DOJ standard process. Done. And the nurse who tried to report the billing discrepancy before I arrived, Margot Vellum. She was placed on administrative suspension 4 months ago. I want that reversed and her record cleared before any indictments are filed. Something moved through Marsh's face that might have been, in a different context, a kind of respect. I'll need AUSA Forsyth to authorize the second condition. Then call her. He looked at her for another moment. Then he took out his phone. The call lasted 11 minutes. Emily could hear one side of it, Marsh's side, which was mostly silence punctuated by occasional short confirmations. When he hung up, he set the phone face down on the table. Forsyth agrees Vellum's suspension will be addressed in the remediation phase. Then I'll take you to the documentation. They left the holding room together, and the station had rearranged itself in the interval. The ordinary ambient authority of the Ashford PD had been displaced, not combatively, not with any dramatic confrontation, but in the specific way that authority gets displaced when something of higher magnitude enters the same space. 4 military investigators were positioned at various points. 2 federal agents Emily hadn't seen before were at a desk with a station supervisor who was speaking in the careful tone of someone cooperating more than they'd planned to. The officer who'd cuffed her in the ambulance bay was standing near the entrance. He saw her emerge from the corridor without cuffs, walking beside Marsh. And something happened in his face. A rapid sequence of reassessment, something uncomfortable, something he was going to have to sit with. She didn't look at him long enough to give it any weight. Outside, the black SUVs were still positioned along the street. The afternoon had moved on while she'd been inside. The light had shifted, the air was colder. Someone had set up a perimeter that extended half a block in each direction. A small cluster of Ashford residents had gathered at the edge of it, the way people gather around things they don't understand but feel they should witness. Marsh's vehicle was the third one. He held the door, which was a functional courtesy rather than a social one, and she got in. The documentation was in 3 locations. She directed them to the first, a secure digital transfer that she accessed using a separate account, stored on a server she'd been quietly building for 9 weeks, populated with photographs, scanned documents, and a series of detailed time-stamped memos she'd been constructing with the same methodical patience she brought to everything she did. The second location was a physical storage unit 2 miles from the hospital where she'd kept hard copies in a waterproof case, because she'd been in enough situations where the digital record disappeared and the physical record was the only thing left. The third was a set of recorded conversations, conducted legally, in Colorado, which allowed single-party consent, with 3 Redstone employees who had information they didn't know they were sharing. Marsh's team worked through all of it over the next 3 hours in a conference room at the federal field office that had been opened up for this operation. Emily sat at the table and answered questions as they arose, and there were a lot of questions, and she answered all of them with the same quality of flatness, not emotionlessness, because flatness and emotionlessness are different things, but the particular compression of affect that comes from having spent years in environments where losing the thread of your own composure meant losing much more than that. The lead analyst on Marsh's team was a woman named PVT First Class Diana Rice, who looked approximately 25 and moved through data with the focused speed of someone who found it genuinely interesting, which Emily recognized as the most useful quality a person in that role could have. At a certain point, Rice looked up from her screen and said, "The shell company, Meridian Health Solutions. Did you know it was incorporated before Graves came to Redstone?" "Yes, 2 years prior." Which means Graves came to Redstone specifically to serve the scheme. He wasn't recruited after the fact. Rice turned back to her screen. "That changes the charge architecture." "I know." Marsh was on the phone in the corridor. Emily could see him through the glass partition, pacing slightly, the way people who are not accustomed to pacing pace when the situation warrants it. She watched the set of his shoulders, and she could read from the outside that whatever he was hearing had not been entirely anticipated. He came back in, closed the door, looked at the room generally before his eyes settled on Emily. "There's a development at the hospital," he said. The development was this. At approximately 4:15 in the afternoon, while Emily had been sitting in a police holding room and then a federal conference room, something had gone wrong in Redstone's ER. Not the ordinary kind of wrong, not a bad outcome or a difficult case, or the chronic under-resourcing that made every shift in that department a managed crisis. Something specific. A trauma case had come in, a road accident, 3 victims, 2 of them critical, and the attending assigned to the ER at that hour was Dr. Philip Satter, who was one of Graves's protected hires, which meant he had credentials that appeared robust on paper and a practical clinical judgment that Emily had flagged internally, in her personal notes, as inadequate for high-acuity trauma work. Diane Okafor had been the charge nurse. She had tried to escalate the attending assignment. She had been told by the shift administrator, a man who reported to Graves, that the staffing was appropriate and she should manage it. She had documented the escalation request. The documentation had, apparently, not been acknowledged. One of the critical patients was still alive. The other had been lost. Marsh told her this carefully, which meant he'd considered whether and how to tell her, and had arrived at the conclusion that she needed to hear it. Emily sat with it for a moment. The conference room was quiet except for the ambient sound of Rice's keyboard. "Which patient survived?" she asked. Marsh checked his notes. "Female, 42. Internal injuries. She's in surgery now." Emily nodded. She looked at the table. She did not perform anything. No visible grief, no audible reaction. But something in the quality of her stillness shifted, and Rice, who had stopped typing without announcing it, noticed. "I flagged Satter in week 5, Emily said. "I documented it. I put it in the escalation channel twice." "I know," Marsh said. "We have that documentation." "It went nowhere because Graves controls the escalation channel." I know, he said again. That's going in the record. She looked up. It needs to be more than in the record. It will be. His voice was even, but there was something beneath it. Not apology, something more operational than apology. The recognition that they were not just dealing with financial crime anymore, that the human cost of what Graves had constructed was no longer hypothetical. The room sat with that for a moment. Then Rice said quietly to her screen, I found the payments to Satter. Marsh moved to her side of the table. Emily did too. On the screen was a payment ledger, routed through a medical staffing company that appeared to be a subsidiary of the same Delaware shell, showing quarterly disbursements to a personal account registered under Philip Satter's Social Security number. 42 payments over a 10.5-year period, all of them consistent and structured to remain below federal reporting thresholds. He's been on the payroll for a decade, Rice said. He's not just a bad doctor they promoted. He's a placed asset. Emily looked at the numbers. She did the arithmetic without needing to write it down. That predates Graves's appointment at Redstone by 3 years. Yes. Which means there was someone running this before Graves. No one said anything for a moment. Marsh straightened. He had the expression of someone revising upward the scope of what they'd walked into. We need to go back further, he said to Rice. Already going, she said. What? What Reese found, over the next hour and 40 minutes, was a structure that had the specific quality of something built carefully over time. Not the improvised opportunism of ordinary institutional corruption, but the deliberate architecture of people who had planned for scrutiny. The shell company. The placed personnel. The billing fraud that was designed to be visible enough to explain a financial imbalance if anyone looked, while the real movement of money happened in the layer beneath. And beneath that layer, a set of connections to county officials, to a regional hospital network, and to 2 individuals in elected positions who had been receiving consulting fees from entities that didn't consult anyone on anything. Emily had found the edge of this. She'd known it was larger than the edge. She hadn't known how much larger. She sat and worked through the documents alongside Rice, and the two of them developed an unspoken efficiency. Rice handling the forensic accounting, Emily contextualizing the clinical pieces. The 2 tracks of evidence feeding into each other in a way that was building, piece by piece, into something that could not be explained away. At 7:40 in the evening, Marsh's phone rang. He answered it, listened for 30 seconds, and said 2 words before hanging up. He looked at the room. Graves is trying to leave Ashford. A federal agent who'd been standing near the door straightened. Airport? Private airstrip, 30 miles east. He was already moving. Rice, secure what you have. I need eyes on the vehicle. He looked at Emily. You should stay here. I know, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, which meant he didn't entirely believe her, which was, in her experience, a reasonable position for him to take. Then he was out the door, and the room contracted from 6 people to 3. Emily looked at the remaining agent, a young woman named Teague, who'd been mostly quiet all day and had the careful eyes of someone absorbing more than she was showing. Do you have the full hospital camera archive from today? Teague checked her tablet. We have the off-site backup, from 6 a.m. onward. I need the feed from the administrative wing, specifically the hallway outside Graves's office, between 2 and 3 p.m. Teague pulled it up. Emily moved her chair to see the screen. The footage was standard security quality. Adequate, not excellent. At 2:18, the hallway outside Graves's office showed Graves himself moving quickly in one direction, followed by a conversation with the shift administrator, a man named Quill, that was brief enough to be a handoff rather than a discussion. Quill went one way, Graves went back to his office. At 2:23, Quill appeared on a different corridor camera near the staff stairwell with a phone to his ear. Can you get audio? Not from the interior cameras. Emily watched the footage. She watched Quill's posture, his hand gestures, the speed at which he moved after the call ended. He's the one who ordered the locker access, she said. We already flagged Boyle as the one who Boyle executed it. Quill ordered it. Quill is who Graves called when I left that consult room. She looked at Teague. Where's Quill now? Teague typed. Checked. Her expression changed in the way expressions change when the answer is not the expected one. He hasn't been seen since approximately 5 p.m., Teague said. He signed out from the hospital. His car is still in the parking structure. The 2 of them looked at each other. Emily thought about the structure Rice had mapped, the shell company, the placed personnel, the decade of careful construction. She thought about what people who'd built something like that did when they felt the structure shifting beneath them. "He's not running," she said. "He's going to someone." "Who?" Emily picked up the folder that Marsh had left on the table. She turned to the last page, the one Rice had added most recently, the one with the county connections and the consulting fees and the names that were, as of an hour ago, the outermost visible edge of what they'd found. She put her finger on a name near the bottom of the page. Teague looked at it. Then she was on her radio. Across Ashford, in the ordinary evening of a city that didn't know what was happening inside its own walls, people were making decisions that were going to define what the next 12 hours looked like. Graves was in a vehicle heading east on a private road toward a small airstrip where someone had arranged something for him. Quill was moving through the city toward a meeting he believed was still possible. And somewhere in the hierarchy above both of them, a person whose name was on the bottom of a federal evidence page had just received a call that told them the situation was deteriorating and was now deciding, with the particular cold calculation of someone who had never personally handled the dirty work, what to cut loose and what to protect. Emily closed the folder. She looked at the city through the conference room window, the lights coming on as the evening settled, the ordinary movement of traffic that didn't know what was moving through it. Rice looked up from her screen. Her face had the specific expression of someone who has found something they weren't expecting and isn't sure yet what it means. "Emily," she said. Emily turned. "The consulting fees," Rice said. "I traced the account they terminate in." She paused. "It's a trust. The beneficiary is listed as a holding entity, but when I pulled the beneficial ownership registration..." She turned the screen. "Does this name mean anything to you?" Emily looked at the screen, and something moved through her face, not surprise because she'd known this was larger than the edge she'd found. But the cold recognition of understanding, finally, how large. The name on the screen was not on any of her documents. It was not on Marsh's folder. It was not anywhere in the 9 weeks of careful evidence construction she'd built in the gaps between patient rounds and overnight shifts. It was the name of the Deputy Police Commissioner of Ashford County. And outside the conference room window, moving through the evening traffic in a dark sedan, was a vehicle she recognized, one she'd seen parked outside Redstone Medical Center's administrative entrance on 4 separate occasions in the last 3 weeks, always late, always brief, always gone before anyone thought to note the plate. She recognized it because she'd noted the plate herself, 11 weeks ago, the first week, because that was how she operated. "Get Marsh on the radio," she said. Her voice was completely level. "Tell him Graves isn't the top." Teague had Marsh on the radio in 40 seconds. The connection was bad. Field static, the particular compression of encrypted military comms that flattened voices into something that sounded vaguely mechanical. But Marsh's response came through clearly enough. "Say that again." "Deputy Commissioner Warren Holt," Emily said, leaning toward the radio. "His name is the beneficial owner of the terminal trust account. The consulting fees route through it." A pause. Not hesitation. Processing. How confident is Rice? Rice, who was already on a second screen pulling beneficial ownership filings, answered without looking up. 90 plus. I'm running the secondary confirmation now, but the primary match is clean. Marsh, Emily said. The sedan I flagged. I've seen it at Redstone 4 times. Always the administrative entrance. Always after 7 p.m. If Holt knows we're moving, he's going to the same place Quill is going. Which is where? I don't know yet, but Holt controls internal affairs for the county sheriff's office, which means he controls who investigates what and who gets warned first. If he's made any calls in the last 2 hours, I'll pull his communication records. Marsh's voice shifted. The particular shift of someone talking to 2 people at once. Then, back to full. Carter, don't go anywhere. The radio cut. Emily looked at Teague, who was already on a separate channel trying to reach the federal agent who'd left with Marsh's vehicle team. Rice was moving through documents at a pace that would have looked frantic on anyone less composed. The room had changed temperature in the way rooms change temperature when the map of a situation expands past the edges of the map you'd been using. Emily pulled a chair beside Rice and looked at the second screen. The beneficial ownership filing was a Delaware registration, 2 pages, filed 16 months ago, routine language, the kind of document that attracted no scrutiny by design. The registered agent was a law firm with a sufficiently generic name. The beneficial owner line had been filled in with a trust designation rather than a personal name, which was legal and also the oldest deflection in the Asset Concealment Manual. Race had found the trust's own registration, filed in South Dakota, and traced the trustee to a holding entity that looped back to a personal financial account in Warren Holt's name through two intermediate steps. It was not simple work. It was the kind of work that required a specific combination of forensic accounting knowledge and investigative patience, and Rice had done it in under 2 hours on a laptop in a conference room while running parallel searches on 4 other data threads. "How old is the trust?" Emily asked. "Established 7 years ago." Rice zoomed in on the filing date. 3 weeks after Holt was appointed deputy commissioner. Emily looked at the date. She looked at the timeline Rice had assembled on the first screen. Satter's placement, Graves's hire, the shell company's incorporation, the billing fraud architecture's first detectable trace. She arranged them in sequence in her head. "Holt didn't join this," she said. "He built it." Rice stopped typing for a moment. "Graves is the manager," Emily said. "Satter is the instrument, the financial structure, the placed personnel, the control of internal reporting channels. That's not something a hospital medical director architects. That requires someone with law enforcement reach, someone who can make sure that when the compliance office flags something, the flag disappears. Someone who can put 2 plainclothes officers in a hospital and have a nurse arrested on a fabricated complaint without anyone in the chain of command questioning it." Rice turned to look at her. "You think Holt ordered the arrest?" "I think Graves asked for it and Holt made it happen." "Yes." They sat with that for a moment. Outside the conference room, the federal field office was operating at an elevated tempo. Voices in corridors, movement, the sound of a printer running continuously. Someone had brought in additional personnel in the last hour. Emily could tell by the change in ambient noise density. Teague came back into the room. "Marsh's team has eyes on Graves. He's still moving toward the airstrip, but they've coordinated with state police, and there's a unit positioning at the access road." She paused. "No sign of Quill yet. And Holt," she checked her tablet. "Holt left the county admin building at 6:52. His department vehicle is in the lot. He left in a personal car." "No tracker on the personal car," Emily said. "No." Emily looked at the window. Night had fully arrived while they'd been in this room. The city was lit now, the ordinary amber and white grid of a mid-sized Colorado city going about its evening. Somewhere in it, a deputy commissioner who'd spent 7 years carefully building an 8-figure corruption network was moving toward something. A meeting, a document, a way out. "What does Holt know about our timeline?" Emily said. Teague pulled up a call log. "We pulled his department phone records within the last 3 hours. He made 4 calls after 5:30, 1 to a number registered to a vehicle leasing company. That might be logistics. 1 to a number we haven't identified yet. 1 to Quill's cell. And the 4th? Teague's expression told her the answer was going to matter before she said it. The 4th was to Assistant U.S. Attorney Forsyth's office. Main number, not her direct line. It went to the after-hours recording. Emily processed that. He was checking whether Forsyth was still in the building. That's one interpretation. It's the right one. She stood up. He knows the federal office is involved. He doesn't know the scope yet, or he'd already be gone. He's trying to assess whether he has time to sanitize something. Sanitize what? Emily turned to Rice. The evidence he keeps himself. Not the financial trail. Holt would know that's distributed enough that he can't reach all of it. But something physical. Something he controls directly that ties him to the operational decisions. The arrest order. Communications with Graves about the timing. Something that in his hands is manageable and in our hands is definitive. Rice was already searching. A safe? A secondary location? Or someone who holds it for him? A lawyer? A trusted contact? Emily thought about the unknown number in Holt's call log. Get me everything you can find on that unidentified number. 6 cases over 14 months, where a patient who should have improved hadn't, or had deteriorated in a pattern that made sense only if the care decisions were being shaped by something other than the patient's actual condition. 2 deaths. She had not been able to prove Satter had directly caused them. She had been able to demonstrate that his documented decision-making at critical junctures was inconsistent with any reasonable clinical standard, and that Graves had signed off on both case reviews without escalation. She'd built that section of the file with more care than any other part of it, because the financial crime was the crime that would generate the indictments, but the patient deaths were the reason any of this mattered, and she needed that to be clear in the record, not as emotion, but as fact, as documented, verifiable, inarguable fact. She was reviewing her notes on the first case when Rice said sharply, "I have the prepaid number's location." Emily looked up. "It pinged a cell tower 40 minutes ago." Rice turned the screen. "The tower serves a radius that includes—" She zoomed the map. "A self-storage facility on Mercer Road, north end of Ashford." Self-storage. Emily turned that over. Not a person holding something for Holt, a place where Holt kept it himself. The kind of place you used when you needed something accessible but not connected to any address or institution that had your name on it. "Teague," she said, "already on it." Teague was on the radio. Emily stood. She looked at the map on Rice's screen and she thought about a man with 7 years of careful construction and 4 hours of deteriorating information moving through a city at night toward the one thing he thought he could still control. I didn't know they had the prepaid number. He didn't know Rice had followed the beneficial ownership trail to his name. He didn't know that the woman he'd had arrested that morning, the woman his system had characterized as just a nurse, had spent 11 weeks building a case that had already survived every attempt to erase it. IUSA Nadia Forsyth arrived at the field office at 8:47, not 40 minutes later, but 23, because she'd been closer than Marsh had indicated or had driven faster than she'd told him. She was 50, compact, with the kind of presence that occupied a room without announcing itself. She came through the door at a pace that suggested she'd already been thinking about this for hours, shook hands with Marsh without breaking stride, and was pulling off her coat and looking at the evidence boards Rice had assembled on the conference room wall before anyone had finished the introductions. She looked at Emily last. She held the look for a moment. "You were the inside source the whole time," she said. "Yes." "We had no indication there was an active embedded operative in Redstone. Nobody told us." "Nobody knew," Emily said. "That was the point." Forsyth absorbed that without visible judgment. She turned to the evidence boards. "Walk me through the patient care documentation." Emily walked her through it. She was precise, and she was thorough, and she did not editorialize. She presented the clinical record, the decision points, the documented deviations, the outcomes, and the pattern that the deviations formed when you arranged them chronologically alongside the financial record. Forsyth listened without interrupting, which was the mark of someone who was actually listening rather than waiting for a gap to assert something. When Emily finished, Forsyth said, "The 2 deaths." "Yes." "You're not alleging direct causation. I'm documenting the conditions that made those outcomes more likely than they should have been as a result of decisions made by a physician whose placement at Redstone was paid for by the scheme and whose case reviews were signed off on by the administrator running the scheme. The causal chain is medical and financial simultaneously." She paused. "I'm not a prosecutor. I'm not going to tell you what charge that supports. But the record is clear." Forsyth looked at her. "You trained as a special operations medic." "Yes." "And you've been working as a civilian nurse for 3 years." "Yes." "Why?" Emily considered whether the question was relevant to the legal proceeding at hand, decided it wasn't, and answered it anyway because Forsyth had asked it directly, and that deserved a direct response. "Because the work matters," she said. "The same reason it mattered in a different context." Forsyth held the look for another moment, then turned back to Marsh. "Where are we on Holt?" "State Police has a unit approaching the Mercer Road facility now," Marsh said. "We should have a location confirmation in—" His radio interrupted him. He listened. "All right." He looked at Forsyth. "Holt's personal vehicle is in the storage facility parking lot." Forsyth's expression sharpened. "Do we have probable cause for entry?" "The vehicle's presence plus the communications intercept plus the financial documentation puts us well into exigent circumstances territory if he's destroying evidence. I can have a federal warrant in 20 minutes from Judge Alcott. She's on standby." "Get it," Forsyth said. She was already pulling out her own phone. The warrant came through in 18 minutes. Marsh was in a vehicle heading north on Ashford's main arterial with 2 federal agents when Teague relayed the authorization, and Emily was in the second vehicle behind him because Forsyth had, after a moment's deliberation that lasted approximately 4 seconds, said, "Bring her," in the tone of someone who'd assessed the tactical value and made a decision. The Mercer Road self-storage facility was a standard commercial installation, a long, low building with individual units facing an internal access road, security fencing, a keypad entry gate. Holt's personal vehicle, a dark blue Jeep Grand Cherokee, was in the small customer parking area near the office. The office was dark. The facility closed at 9. It was 8 minutes past. Marcia's vehicle stopped at the gate. A state police cruiser was already positioned at the facility's secondary exit. Emily sat in the back of the second vehicle and looked at the facility through the window. The access road curved around the corner of the building, and from this angle she could see a strip of the internal road and the front faces of approximately 8 units. 7 of them were dark. One showed a thin line of light at the bottom of the roll door, narrow, barely visible, but there. "Unit facing the east internal road," she said. "Third from the far end." The federal agent in the passenger seat relayed it. They were through the gate 40 seconds later and moving. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not cinematic. It rarely was. The entry team moved to the unit with the light while Marsh and a second agent approached Holt's vehicle and confirmed it was empty. Someone called the unit number. Someone identified federal investigators and instructed the occupant to step back from the roll door. There was a pause, not a long one, maybe 8 seconds, and then the sound of movement inside. Warren Holt opened the roll door himself. He was 61, heavy-set without being unfit, with the particular bearing of a man who'd spent decades in institutional authority and had difficulty releasing it even in circumstances that made it irrelevant. He was holding a phone, not the prepaid, his personal phone, screen lit, in the act of being used. Behind him, a folding table was covered with manila folders and a single external hard drive, and a paper shredder in the corner was still running. The agent beside Emily stepped forward. "Sir, step away from the table. Do not touch anything on that surface." Holt looked at the agent. He looked at Marsh. His eyes moved to Emily, and something happened in his face, a rapid sequence of recognition and recalibration. He had seen her. Not in person. From somewhere. From some document or photograph or surveillance still that Graves had shared with him at some point during the 11 weeks when she'd been the problem they were trying to manage. He knew who she was. Emily looked back at him and said nothing. "I want my attorney," Holt said. "You'll have your attorney," Marsh said. "Right now I need you to step away from the table and put the phone down." Holt set the phone on the table. Not the way you set something down when you're complying, but the way you set something down when you've already done what you needed to do with it. Emily noticed. She looked at the phone's screen, which was facing down now but had been facing up a moment ago. "He sent something," she said quietly to Teague. Teague was already on it. Holt took 2 steps back from the table. He put his hands at his sides. He looked at the room with the expression of a man constructing his narrative in real time, calculating what was gone, what might be salvageable, what version of events might still create enough uncertainty to be useful. "Whatever you think you have," he said, mostly to Marsh, "is not what you think it is." "Deputy Commissioner," Marsh said, "I think what we have is a federal warrant, a secured evidence location, and a shredder running." He looked at the shredder. "Agent Teague, can we determine how long that's been operating?" Teague was crouching near the shredder. "Recent. The bin's warm." The paper was in strips, potentially recoverable. Document reconstruction was standard forensic work, but partially compromised. Holt had been here for some time before they'd arrived. 20 minutes, maybe 30. Long enough to have gotten through a portion of whatever he'd come here to destroy. One of the federal agents was already photographing the table's surface before touching anything. The manila folders were labeled in a handwriting that was careful and consistent, not typed labels, handwritten, which meant Holt had not wanted these to go through any system that touched a printer or computer. Emily looked at the labels from where she stood. She could read 2 of them from the angle. One said RMC Internal, Q2, Q3, and one said Staffing, Placed Personnel. She looked at Marsh. He had seen them too. "Holt," Marsh said. "The phone. What did you send?" Holt said nothing. "It doesn't matter in terms of this evidence," Marsh said, which was partially true. "It matters because whoever you sent it to is now a subject of this investigation, and obstructing evidence on their behalf is—" "I want my attorney," Holt said again. His voice was flat and held. Marsh stepped back. He spoke quietly to the agent beside him. Then he looked at Emily, and she crossed the distance to him. "The send," she said, keeping her voice low. "Who does he warn from here?" "If Quill is already with whoever Quill is with, then the warning is for—" Marsh stopped. Emily finished it. "Whoever Quill was going to, which we still haven't identified." Marsh's jaw tightened marginally. Rice is still on the unknown contact thread. "There's something above Holt," Emily said. "We've been building toward Holt as the top. But the trust structure, a deputy commissioner building that level of financial architecture, doesn't do it without someone further up providing cover. Political cover. Someone with enough reach to make sure that when the financial compliance system flagged something at the state level, it didn't escalate." Marsh looked at her. He looked at the folders on the table. He looked at Holt, who was standing with his hands at his sides and his expression sealed like a door. "The folders," Emily said. Marsh turned to the agent doing photography. "Fast as you can." So, they were back at the federal field office by 10:15. Holt was in a separate vehicle, separated from the evidence, not speaking. The folders from the storage unit had been photographed in situ and were now in sealed evidence bags in transit to a secure processing room. Forsyth was on the phone when Marsh came back in. She held up one finger, the universal signal for 30 more seconds, and then ended the call and looked at him. "Quill surfaced," she said. "State police found him at a gas station outside of Hartwell. He's been in his car for 2 hours. He says he wants to talk." Marsh straightened. "He wants a deal." "He says he has information about individuals above Holt's level." The room went very quiet. Rice looked up from her screens. Teague stopped writing. Emily, who was standing near the window with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, turned around. "Above Holt," Marsh said. "That's what he said." Forsyth looked at Emily. "You called it." Emily set the coffee down. "What does he want?" "Full cooperation credit. No jail time, supervised release. He says what he has is worth it." "It might be," Emily said, "depending on what he has." He gave one name as a preview, to establish good faith. Forsyth's expression was difficult to read, not reluctant to share it, but measuring the impact before she did. State Senator Douglas Pritchard. The name landed in the room like a dropped instrument, sudden, resonant, all the other noise momentarily gone. Emily knew the name. Everyone in Ashford County knew the name. Douglas Pritchard had been a state senator for 14 years, sat on the legislature's Health and Human Services Committee, and had been, for the entire duration of his tenure, publicly and vocally committed to healthcare accountability and the exposure of medical fraud. He had given a speech about Redstone Medical Center specifically, 8 months ago, praising its community health record. Emily looked at Forsyth. "He's been running cover as a reformer." "That appears to be the operating theory, yes." "For how long?" "That," Forsyth said, "is what Quill is going to tell us." She looked at Marsh. "I want a deal memo drafted in the next 30 minutes. I want Quill in a room by midnight." Marsh was already on the phone. Emily turned back to the window. The city outside was the same city it had been 2 hours ago. Same lights, same grid, same ordinary movement of people who didn't know that the institutional structure they moved through had been, for a long time, something other than what it appeared. A hospital where some of the personnel were placed. A police department where the internal oversight reported to a man running a fraud network. A senator who stood at podiums and talked about accountability and then deposited consulting fees from a shell company into a trust. She thought about the patient who died that afternoon in Redstone's ER, while Satter made decisions that a competent physician wouldn't have made. She thought about the family that was somewhere in this city right now, inside that loss, with no knowledge yet of why it had happened or whether it could have been prevented. She thought about what the word accountability meant when you applied it to that, not as policy language, not as a charge sheet item, but as a practical question about what a human being owed to another human being when their decisions had determined whether that person lived or died. Her phone buzzed. Not her personal phone, the separate number. The one she'd put in her locker that morning, the one the hospital security supervisor had opened the locker to find and hadn't found because it wasn't there, because she didn't keep the phone she needed in a place that could be reached. She stepped away from the window and answered it. The voice on the other end was familiar. Someone she hadn't spoken to in 8 months. Someone whose position she was not going to name even in her own internal accounting of this situation, but whose contact had been the original authorization for the assignment at Redstone. "I see the situation has developed," the voice said. "Faster than expected on the upper levels," she said. "Pritchard." "You knew?" A pause. "We suspected. We couldn't move on suspicion." She absorbed that. It was true. It was also the kind of truth that had a complicated texture when you held it alongside the patient who died that afternoon. She didn't say that. It wouldn't change anything, and she wasn't in the habit of saying things that wouldn't change anything. "What do you need from me?" the voice asked. "The clinical evidence needs an independent medical review before it goes to the U.S. attorney formally. I need a CMO-level sign-off from someone outside the Colorado system. I can have someone to Forsyth by morning. Thank you." "Carter." The voice paused. "You should know. The original arrest this morning triggered a formal review by the Army's Inspector General office. Your embedded assignment, your clinical status, all of it. There will be questions about your authorization chain. I know. It could create complications for your record." She looked at the city through the window. "The record is secondary," she said. "The patients aren't." The line went quiet for a moment. Not disconnected, just the particular silence of someone who had heard something they'd been expecting and found it, in the hearing, more complicated than it had seemed in the anticipation. "I'll have the medical reviewer contact Forsyth," the voice said, and ended the call. Emily put the phone in her pocket. She turned back to the room, where Rice was pulling up a new document on her screen with the focused energy of someone who'd found a thread worth pulling. And Teague was coordinating with state police on Quill's transport. And Marsh was off the phone and looking at Emily with the expression of someone who'd just received information he hadn't asked for, but needed. "Forsyth wants you in the interview with Quill," he said. "She says you'll recognize things we might not." "All right." "It starts in," he checked, "50 minutes. Hartwell is 40 minutes out." He moved toward the door. Emily followed. She pulled her jacket from the back of a chair as she passed it, and as she did, Rice said, "Emily," with a quality of urgency that was different from the urgency that had been in the room for the last 4 hours. She stopped. "What?" Rice had turned her screen. On it was a document. Not a financial record, not a call log. A scanned photograph of a handwritten note on Redstone Medical Center letterhead. The date at the top was 10 days before Emily had started her embedded assignment at the hospital. She moved to Rice's side. She read it. It was 4 lines. The handwriting was Graves's. She'd seen enough of his written notations and patient charts to recognize it. The note was addressed to no one by name. It said, "If the embedded operative surfaces, the arrest protocol is standing authorization. Holt has confirmed. Use Boyle's channel. Do not put this in digital form." She stared at it. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "The folders from the storage unit," Rice said. "The one labeled RMC internal." They had been tracking the corruption's financial architecture. They had been building the evidentiary case for the billing fraud, the placed personnel, the obstruction. They had known the arrest this morning was ordered. What they had not known, what this note now made explicit, in Graves's own handwriting, with Holt's name attached, was that the arrest protocol had been authorized before Emily had ever set foot in Redstone Medical Center, which meant they had known she was coming, which meant there was someone above Holt, above even Pritchard, who had access to the original assignment brief, a document that was classified, compartmentalized, and held by exactly 3 people in the world. Emily's hand was resting on the table beside Rice's screen. She was aware of it, and she was aware that it had stopped moving, and she was aware that this was the kind of moment where the architecture of everything you believed you understood about a situation shifts on its axis, and you have to stay very still inside the shift in order to think clearly. "Marsh," she said. Her voice was completely flat. He came back to her side. He read the note. "I was quiet for 3 seconds," she counted, involuntarily, because counting was what she did when she needed her mind to stay precise. He looked up. His face had the expression she'd seen in the holding room when he'd first understood the scope, but different now. Worse. "Someone inside the authorization chain," he said. "Yes." "That narrows it to 3 people," she said, "one of whom made a phone call to me 20 minutes ago." The room had gone very quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when the walls of a situation turn out to be farther away than anyone calculated. Marsh's hand went to his radio, and Emily stood at the edge of what she knew and what she didn't yet know, and the gap between those two things had just become the most dangerous ground in the room. Marsh's radio call lasted 90 seconds. He spoke in the clipped, effectless register of someone transmitting information that needs to arrive intact, not interpreted. Unit designations, a request for a communications security audit on the original assignment brief, a flag on all outbound contact from the 3 individuals in the authorization chain, effective immediately. When he was done, he set the radio down and looked at Emily with an expression that had very deliberately removed everything from it that wasn't operational. "You said one of the 3 called you 20 minutes ago," he said. "Yes." "And that person indicated knowledge of the Pritchard development." "They used the name before I mentioned it." Marsh processed that with the stillness of someone holding something heavy and choosing not to put it down yet. "The other 2 in the authorization chain." "Colonel Dara Winslow, Army Medical Command, Fort Carson," Emily said. "She's the one who recruited me for the assignment. And Deputy Director Marcus Lane, DIA, out of the DC office. He provided the federal authorization that allowed civilian embedding. Lane made the call to you." It wasn't a question, because Marsh had already worked through the probability and arrived at the same place she had. She confirmed it anyway. "Yes." Marsh turned to Rice. "I need everything publicly available on Marcus Lane's financial disclosure records, whatever the DIA files with the Executive Ethics Office." He looked back at Emily. "This might not be what it looks like." "I know," she said. "It might be a coincidence that he knew Pritchard's name before we'd reported it upward through any channel." She paused. "I've been working in environments where coincidence carries a very specific cost when you act on it incorrectly. I'm not accusing Lane, I'm telling you what I observed." "Understood." He picked up his phone rather than the radio. A deliberate choice, a more secure channel. "I need to make a call that does not go through any system Lane has visibility into." He stepped out of the room. Emily watched him go and then turned back to the note on Rice's screen. 4 lines in Graves's handwriting. The embedded operative. The arrest protocol. Standing authorization. Holt has confirmed. They had known she was coming. The question of how they had known was now either the most important question in the investigation or a question whose answer would unravel something larger than the corruption network at Redstone. Both possibilities were uncomfortable. One of them was significantly worse. She looked at the date on the note again. 14 days before her assignment began. That meant someone had known about the assignment at the planning stage. Not after she'd arrived at Redstone, not after she'd started building her evidence file, but before she'd walked through the hospital's doors for the first time. At the planning stage, the number of people with access was small enough to count on one hand. Rice was pulling financial disclosure records. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when the work inside them has reached a point that requires concentration rather than urgency. Teague was at the door, running logistics for the Quill transport. Outside, through the conference room's glass partition, the federal field office continued its elevated activity. Additional agents, additional screens, a printer that had been running for an hour. Emily sat down. She pulled the evidence folder, Marsh's original folder, the one he'd brought to the holding room, and turned to the last pages, the ones Rice had added during the evening's work. She looked at the financial architecture, the shell company, the trust, the consulting fees, the placed personnel. 14 months of documented activity that they'd mapped with reasonable completeness. But the note from the storage unit had introduced a layer above the architecture they'd mapped, and the question of how that layer connected to the structure below it was one she couldn't answer from the documents she had. Someone above Holt had known about the embedded assignment, that someone had communicated that knowledge to Holt, who had communicated it to Graves, who had written it down, carefully, in handwriting, on physical paper, because it was the kind of information that couldn't go into any system, which meant the person above Holt also understood operational security at a level that exceeded what you'd expect from a state senator or a county official. You develop that understanding in specific environments: military, intelligence, federal law enforcement. She was still looking at the folder when Marsh came back in. His face had the quality of someone who had just received information that reorganized the room. "Lane left D.C. this afternoon," he said. "Commercial flight to Denver, landed at 6:20. His office says he's traveling for a conference." "There's no conference." The room absorbed that. "He's in Colorado," Emily said. "Somewhere in the metro area as of 90 minutes ago. I have someone pulling his cell tower data now. He looked at Teague. The Quill interview needs to happen now, not midnight, now. They drove to Hartwell in 41 minutes. Forsyth was in the lead vehicle. Marsh and Emily were in the second. Marsh spent the drive on encrypted comms while Emily sat with the window cracked 2 inches and the cold night air coming in and thought about Marcus Lane. She'd met him twice, both times in official settings. The authorization briefing for the Redstone assignment, which had been conducted at a secure facility in Fort Carson and had lasted 3 hours, and a check-in call 6 weeks into the assignment that she'd initiated when the scope of what she was finding had begun to exceed the original parameters. Both times he'd been professional and measured, the way career intelligence officials are professional and measured, which told you very little about what they actually were underneath the professionalism and the measure. What she remembered specifically, he'd asked in the check-in call whether she'd identified any financial connections extending beyond the hospital. She'd said she was still mapping the external structure. He'd said to be thorough. She'd said she intended to be. The call had lasted 9 minutes. She thought about what a man in his position, with access to the assignment brief, could have provided to Holt that would be worth the risk of the connection. The name of the operative, the timeline, the parameters, what she'd been authorized to investigate, and, by implication, what she hadn't. The edges of the mandate, which would tell a careful person exactly where to concentrate the concealment. If Lane was connected to the network, he'd spent 6 weeks knowing she was inside Redstone and knowing what she was and wasn't authorized to touch. He would have shaped the conspiracy's behavior accordingly. The question was whether she'd found enough anyway. Whether the 11 weeks of documentation she'd built had captured what his guidance had been designed to keep her from seeing. She thought she had. She wasn't certain. Certainty was a position she reserved for things she could verify, and this was not yet one of them. The Hartwell State Police substation was smaller than the Ashford facility, a converted building that had been a county annex at some point in a previous decade, with a parking lot that held 6 vehicles and fluorescent lighting inside that flickered at the far end of the corridor. Quill was in a room at that end, with a state police detective and a public defender who'd been reached by phone and had arrived looking like someone who'd dressed in the dark. Quill himself was 53, thin in the way people get thin when stress has been metabolizing them for years, with eyes that moved too quickly around the room when Emily and Marsh came in. He looked at Emily and looked away and looked back. "You were the nurse," he said. "I was the nurse," she said. She sat down across from him. Marsh stood near the wall. Forsyth sat to Emily's left. The public defender put his hand on Quill's arm briefly, a reminder rather than a restraint. "My client is prepared to provide full cooperation in exchange for the terms discussed," the public defender said. "We have the terms in writing," Forsyth said. "Your client should understand that the value of the cooperation determines the final structure of the agreement." He said he has information about individuals above Deputy Commissioner Holt. "I need to hear that information." Quill looked at the table. He had the specific posture of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally arrived at the moment of putting it down, and doesn't entirely trust that the ground will hold. "Lane," he said. The word sat in the room. "Marcus Lane," Forsyth said, Deputy Director, DIA. "He's been the roof," Quill said. "I don't know the financials, that's Holt's side. What I know is operational. When the Redstone scheme started attracting attention from state-level auditors 3 years ago, Holt said the attention had been managed. He said there was someone at the federal level who could redirect inquiries. A year later, when the state health department flagged the billing patterns, the flag was reviewed by a federal interagency working group that concluded there was no evidence of systematic fraud. Lane chaired that working group. Forsyth wrote something on the legal pad in front of her. "You have documentation of Lane's involvement in the working group outcome?" "I have emails between Holt and Graves discussing the outcome. Holt said, and I'm quoting as best I remember, 'Our ceiling held, the federal chair closed it down.'" He paused. "I don't have Lane's name in writing. Holt was careful, but he told me directly, twice, who the ceiling was. He used Lane's name." "When?" "Once 18 months ago when I asked how the state audit had gone away. Once 6 weeks ago when the embedded operative," he glanced at Emily. "When Holt told me there was someone inside the hospital. He said the information had come from the ceiling and that we had time to manage it. 6 weeks ago. Emily held that number. 6 weeks ago, she had made the check-in call to Lane in which she described the external financial structure she was mapping. 6 weeks ago, Holt had received information from his ceiling contact that there was an operative inside Redstone and that they had time to manage it. Lane had told them she was there. Lane had described what she was authorized to look at. And then he had called her 20 minutes ago from somewhere in the Denver metro area, using Pritchard's name before she'd reported it, which meant he'd known Pritchard's name had surfaced, which meant he had a source inside the current investigation who had told him. Lane has a contact inside the current operation, she said. Not to Quill. To Marsh. Marsh's expression told her he'd been arriving at the same place. Or access to a communication channel we haven't secured. How many people knew Pritchard's name before Lane called me? In this operation, Marsh thought. Forsyth, the state police detective at the Hartwell gas station, whoever that detective radioed when Quill gave the name. Forsyth had straightened. The Hartwell detective radioed his supervisor at 6:53. The supervisor is Captain Aldrich Bowen. Bowen has... She stopped. She picked up her phone. The room waited. Forsyth spoke for 40 seconds to someone on the other end. When she hung up, her voice had the careful flatness of someone managing a reaction. Captain Bowen has a brother-in-law in the federal government. The brother-in-law is listed as a senior advisor in the DIA's Public Affairs Office. The chain from Quill's name to Lane's phone call had just become visible, and it was exactly 3 links long. They secured Quill's recorded statement and were back in the vehicles by 11:40. Marsh coordinated with Army CID during the drive to request a location trace on Lane's current position. The cell tower data came back before they reached the Ashford city limits. Lane's phone had last pinged a tower serving a radius that included the Marquette Hotel, a mid-range business property 12 blocks from Redstone Medical Center. Forsyth authorized an approach, not an arrest. They didn't have an arrest warrant, and the evidentiary connection to Lane was still testimonial, still one step away from documentary proof. An approach, a conversation. The kind of conversation where what a person says and how they say it becomes part of the record. It was 12:20 when they walked into the Marquette Hotel's lobby. The desk clerk looked up with the expression of someone calculating whether the late-arriving group of people in professional clothing was a problem or a procedure. Marsh showed credentials, asked for the room registered to Marcus Lane. The clerk typed, looked at the screen. We don't have a guest by that name. What name did he check in under? The clerk typed again. I'm not able to... This is a federal investigation, Forsyth said. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. I need the room number for the individual who checked in this evening using a government travel card issued to the Defense Intelligence Agency. That card number will appear in your system. The clerk typed, paused. Room 412. They took the stairs. Room 412 was at the end of the 4th floor corridor, which was quiet and badly lit in the way hotel corridors are quiet and badly lit at 12:30 on a Tuesday night. Marsh knocked. 3 knocks. The law enforcement knock. Not aggressive, but with a specificity of rhythm that meant something. 30 seconds. Nothing. He knocked again. The door opened on the chain. Through the gap, a man in his late 50s, dressed but not formally, jacket off, collar open. He looked at Marsh. He looked at Forsyth. He looked at Emily. And what moved through his face in that moment was the thing she'd been watching for. Not surprise, not confusion, but the specific expression of someone encountering a situation they'd modeled and finding that the model was insufficient. Deputy Director Lane, Marsh said, we'd like to speak with you. A pause. Do you have a warrant? We have questions, Forsyth said. Answering them voluntarily is better for everyone, including you. Another pause. The chain slid off the door. The room was a standard business hotel room. Desk, chair, bed, the anonymous furniture of temporary occupancy. On the desk, a laptop, closed. A phone, personal, not his DIA-issued device. A glass of water. A legal pad with 2 lines of notes that Emily clocked from the doorway and couldn't read at that angle. Lane sat in the desk chair. He didn't offer them seats, which was either the behavior of a man asserting territorial control over the conversation or a man whose mind was on something else. Marsh and Forsyth sat anyway. Emily stood near the wall, which was where she usually was. You called me tonight, she said. At approximately 10:50. I did, Lane said. You used Pritchard's name. I'd received information that Pritchard was a subject of your investigation. From whom? He looked at her steadily. He had good composure, the composure of someone who'd built it deliberately over years of operating in environments where composure was a survival skill. I'd rather not say at this moment. The person you received it from is Captain Aldrich Bowen of the Hartwell State Police, through his brother-in-law, who works in your office's Public Affairs Division, Emily said. We've already mapped that chain. Something shifted behind Lane's eyes. Not panic, recalibration. Marcus, Forsyth said, and the use of his first name was a deliberate choice. Not familiarity, a reduction of the institutional distance that made it easier for someone to hide behind their title. We have Quill's statement. We have the storage unit documents. We have the financial architecture back to Holt. What we are here to determine is how far above Holt this extends, and whether your involvement was operational or whether you were a resource that was used without your full awareness. It was a door, a narrow one. Forsyth was offering it because the goal of this conversation was not to corner a deputy director of the DIA in a hotel room at 12:30. It was to understand the full scope of the network, and a man who felt the door existed was more likely to give them that than a man with no options. Lane looked at the closed laptop on the desk. He was silent for 8 seconds. Emily counted. The working group, he said finally. 3 years ago, the state audit review. Yes, Forsyth said. I was asked by someone in my chain of command to ensure the working group's findings were calibrated, that the audit conclusions would be reviewed with appropriate skepticism about the audit methodology. Who in your chain of command? He looked at the table. I want guarantees in writing before I go further. I can have a cooperation agreement in front of you within 2 hours, Forsyth said, but I need to know the name is worth 2 hours of my night. Lane looked at Emily. It was a strange look. Not hostile, not apologetic, something more complicated than either. The look of a man assessing the person sitting across the table from the wreckage of a decision he'd made 3 years ago and had spent 3 years telling himself was manageable. General Harold Voss, he said, retired, currently a board member of 4 private health industry companies, 2 of which are defense-adjacent contractors. Forsyth's pen stopped moving on her legal pad. Voss told me the audit was a fishing expedition by a state office with an agenda, Lane said. He said the hospital network in question was a strategic asset for several ongoing military healthcare contracts, and that the audit findings would create complications for procurement channels that mattered at the federal level. He paused. I didn't know about the patient fraud. I didn't know about the billing scheme or the placed personnel. I understood there was a financial arrangement I was helping to insulate from scrutiny. I knew that was wrong. I told myself the healthcare contract rationale was legitimate. He stopped. It wasn't. The room was very quiet. Where's Voss now? Marsh asked. He lives in Scottsdale, but he travels. He has a property in Breckenridge he uses in winter. Marsh was on the phone before Lane finished the sentence. What followed was not quiet. It was the specific organized chaos of an investigation that has just expanded into a jurisdiction it hadn't anticipated, requiring the coordination of multiple agencies across 2 states at 1 in the morning, with a retired 2-star general as the newest subject, and a DIA deputy director sitting in a hotel room writing the terms of his cooperation agreement in longhand on Forsyth's legal pad. Emily did not participate in most of it. She sat in a corner of the hotel room and watched and processed, and at a certain point Marsh handed her a phone so she could answer 3 questions from an Army IG representative who was being looped in on the Voss development and needed her to verify elements of the original assignment brief. She answered the questions. She handed the phone back. At 2:15, Rice called from the field office with a document pull from a defense contracting database that connected 2 of Voss's board positions to procurement arrangements with the same regional hospital network that the Redstone billing fraud fed into. The money trail didn't end at Holt's trust account. It pooled into a larger structure that had been moving federal healthcare contract funds through private channels for, Rice's estimate, pending full forensic accounting, somewhere between 5 and 8 years. 5 to 8 years. Emily thought about that number and what it meant in terms of the patients who'd moved through the institutions involved during that period. Not just Redstone, the network. She thought about Satter, about the 2 deaths in his case file that she'd documented because the deviations in his clinical decisions were too consistent and too convenient to be incompetence alone. She thought about whether, somewhere in the other institutions connected to this network, there were nurses or technicians or attending physicians who had noticed something and had not known what to do with the noticing, or had tried to escalate and found the escalation channel went nowhere. She thought about Margot Vellum, suspended 4 months ago for reporting a billing discrepancy. Vellum was asleep right now, somewhere in Ashford, inside the injustice of a suspension she'd been handed for doing exactly what she should have done. By morning, or by the morning after, when the formal remediation process could be initiated, that would begin to change. Forsyth had authorized it. The cooperation agreement with Quill had it embedded as a condition. The record was going to be corrected. It wasn't nothing. Emily held on to that. At 2:40, she stepped out into the hotel corridor and stood by the window at the far end. The city at this hour was reduced to essential light. Street lamps, the occasional vehicle, the distant movement of something she couldn't identify. Colorado in January at almost 3 in the morning had a particular quality of cold and stillness that she'd always found clarifying. Marsh came out after a few minutes. He stood beside her without preamble. Voss was located, he said. Breckenridge property. Summit County Sheriff's Office is sitting on it until federal agents arrive from Denver. He's not going anywhere. How long until the warrants are ready? Forsyth has a federal judge on the phone right now. 40 minutes, maybe. She nodded. Outside, a truck moved through an intersection 3 blocks away, its lights sweeping the pale storefronts. The assignment brief compromised, she said. My original mission. The IG is going to want a full accounting of how the brief was accessed. Yes, that's going to take time. And while it's taking time, my embedded status is technically in a gray area. Forsyth has already spoken to U.S. Attorney's Office about your role in the investigation, Marsh said. You're a material witness, a cooperating party, and an embedded operative whose mission was compromised by a subject of the investigation. You're not in a gray area legally. You're in the clearest possible standing. I mean politically, she said. He looked at her. I know what you mean. She looked at the city. It doesn't change anything. The record is the record. The record, Marsh said, is going to look extraordinary, whatever the IG process produces. She didn't respond to that. She was thinking about Redstone, about the ER she'd clocked into at 6:42 that morning, which was now almost 20 hours ago, about the morning handoff notes she'd skimmed standing up, about Gerald in Bay 9, who'd been frightened and had needed someone to explain things to him clearly, and about the fact that she'd been pulled from that building in handcuffs 6 hours into her shift and hadn't been back since. She thought about the 42-year-old woman who'd survived surgery, the one who'd come in with the road accident while Satter was the attending. She was out of surgery now, presumably, in a recovery room. The outcome wasn't the outcome it should have been for the other victim, but she was alive. And the work of the people who'd fought for that outcome, the surgical team, the recovery nurses, whoever had been beside her bed in the hours since, that work had happened regardless of everything happening in this hotel corridor. That was the thing about the work. It continued independently of everything else. People kept needing it, and it kept mattering, and the machinery that had been designed to corrupt the institution around it hadn't managed to corrupt the work itself. Not entirely. Marsh's phone buzzed. He read the screen. Forsyth has the warrant language finalized. We're moving to Breckenridge. She pushed off the wall. All right. Carter. He stopped her before she turned. The people in that hospital, the ones who worked tonight not knowing what was happening, the charge nurse, the surgical team. She waited. They were working in an institution that was being run as a fraud vehicle, he said, and they were still doing the actual job. Yes, she said. So were you. She looked at him for a moment. She didn't answer that because it wasn't a question and because the thing he was describing was simply the job as she understood it. You did it regardless of the conditions around it, because the conditions around it were not what made it matter. She turned and walked toward the stairs. The drive to Breckenridge was 94 minutes. Emily spent most of it in the back of Marsh's vehicle, not sleeping, organizing in her mind the sequence of what still needed to happen. The Voss arrest, the warrant execution, the formal charging document that Forsyth was constructing for simultaneous filing against Holt, Graves, Satter, Pritchard, and now Lane, The remediation order for the patient records. Vellum's suspension reversal. Dawn was beginning. Not the arrival of light exactly, but the first thinning of dark, the sky transitioning from black to a deep cold blue. When the vehicles approached the Breckenridge property, a Summit County cruiser was parked at the end of the access road. The deputy behind the wheel had been there since 2:40 and looked like it. The property was a large log construction house set back from the road with a mountain backdrop that in daylight would be the kind of view that cost what it cost. In pre-dawn blue, it was just a dark structure with 2 lights on, one on the ground floor, one upper level. Forsyth led. 3 federal agents flanked. Marsh and Emily stayed at the perimeter of the approach while the agents went to the door. The knock, the identification, the pause. And then the door opened, and a man in his early 70s in a thick robe stood in the doorway of his mountain house at 6 in the morning, looking at federal credentials with the specific expression of someone who has known, for some indeterminate period, that a morning like this was coming, and has spent that period deciding how to hold themselves when it arrived. General Harold Voss, retired, board member, the roof above the roof, had apparently decided to hold himself with the particular rigid dignity of a man who believed that Bering could substitute for the position he'd lost the moment those credentials appeared. He was wrong about that. But he stood in the doorway very straight. The lead agent spoke. The Miranda language came out with the flat precision of something recited accurately. Voss listened. He did not interrupt. He looked once past the agents toward where Marsh was standing, and then his eyes moved to Emily, and he held there for a moment, looking at the woman in scrubs who was still wearing what she'd been wearing when they'd arrested her 22 hours ago, who was standing in the cold mountain pre-dawn with her arms at her sides and her face giving away nothing at all. He looked away. They brought him out of the house in handcuffs, which was not dignified and was not meant to be. The federal agent guiding him to the vehicle was professional. The cuffs were applied correctly. None of it was rough. Emily watched from 30 feet away. She did not feel what she'd expected to feel, standing there watching the man who sat at the top of the structure that had spent 11 weeks trying to bury her, who had used federal authority to protect a network that had killed patients and corrupted an institution and tried to use her own arrest as a lid on the evidence she'd spent 11 weeks building. She expected something that resolved cleanly. Instead, what she felt was more complicated and more tired. The complicated exhaustion of being present at the end of something large, when the ending is right and necessary, and is also just the beginning of a long legal process that will unfold without her in courtrooms she won't sit in. The work was done, her part of it. The next part belonged to Forsyth and to time. The vehicle carrying Voss moved down the access road. The Summit County deputy pulled out behind it. The mountain behind the house was beginning to show its outline against the lightening sky. Marsh came to stand beside her. They watched the vehicles go. Forsyth is filing at 9 a.m., he said. All of them simultaneously? Holt, Graves, Satter, Pritchard, Voss, Lane separately under the cooperation terms. He paused. Vellum's suspension reversal goes to Redstone's HR department at 8. Emily nodded. There's one more thing, Marsh said. His voice had changed slightly. Not grave, something more careful. The Army IG completed an expedited review of your assignment breach during the night. Rice was coordinating with them. She looked at him. The review found that the breach was attributable to Lane's access to the original brief and his communication of operative details to Holt. It also found, he paused, it found that your mission produced results that exceeded its original parameters by a significant margin, under conditions that included active compromise of the mission by a superior in the authorization chain. He looked at her directly. The IG's preliminary finding is that your record is not only clear, but that the assignment should be classified as successfully completed. She took that in. They also found, he continued, that the protocol used to authorize your arrest, the way Holt and Graves triggered and executed it, constitutes a deliberate targeting of a military intelligence asset. That's a separate charge. Federal. It's been added to the Holt filing. The sky was fully transitioning now. A cold orange was beginning at the eastern edge of the mountains. Not dramatic, just the ordinary indifferent sunrise of a Wednesday in January. Emily looked at it. 22 hours ago, she'd been on her knees in the ambulance bay of Redstone Medical Center, with her hands cuffed behind her back while an officer told a crowd of onlookers she was just a nurse. She was thinking about that when Marsh's phone rang. He answered it, listened for 15 seconds, and his face moved in a way she'd learned to read over the past 12 hours. The specific shift of someone receiving information that changes the texture of a situation they thought they understood. He lowered the phone. "Satter," he said. "He's been at the hospital all night. When the staff rotation came in this morning and word started to spread about the investigation, someone warned him." He paused. "He's in the ICU right now. He demanded access to the 42-year-old woman from yesterday's accident." Emily turned to face him fully. "The charge nurse on duty, a woman named Okafor, blocked him from the room," Marsh said. "Satter is claiming he has attending authority. Okafor is refusing. Hospital administration has been called." "Hospital administration at 6 in the morning is whoever the overnight administrator is," Emily said, "which is someone who reports to Graves's office," Marsh said. "Yes." "Diane will hold," Emily said. It came out with a certainty she hadn't planned to put into it, but there it was. She knew Diane Okafor. She knew exactly how Diane held. "She's been holding for 40 minutes, Marsh said. "But Satter has a second physician backing him, and they're about to go over her head to the overnight admin." Emily looked at the fading mountain view. She looked at Marsh. "I need a vehicle," she said. He was already on the phone. The drive from Breckenridge to Ashford was 94 minutes in ordinary conditions. The federal driver made it in 71. The sun came up fully during the drive, which meant it was daylight, clear and cold and ordinary, when the vehicle pulled into Redstone Medical Center's ambulance bay at 7:43. Emily got out. She straightened her scrubs, the same scrubs she'd worn for 23 hours, the ones she'd been cuffed in, the ones she'd worn through 11 hours of federal investigation. She looked at the ER entrance. She walked in. The ER at Redstone at 7:43 on a Wednesday morning was operating at its normal controlled chaos. The overnight patients being handed off to the day team, the first admissions of the morning coming through, the particular density of activity that defined the first hour of the day shift. People saw her. She was aware of that. Heads turning. The specific stillness of people who don't know whether to speak or not. She walked past all of it toward the ICU corridor. She could hear them before she turned the corner, Satter's voice, carrying the pitched authority of a man who's accustomed to institutional weight working in his favor and is finding, with disorienting rapidity, that it isn't. Beside him, another voice, measured and deferential in a way that suggested it was backing Satter's position without being confident in it. And against both of them, very even, not loud, Diane Okafor's voice saying, "You are not entering this room." Emily came around the corner. Satter saw her first. Something moved through his face, a sequence of reactions that arrived too fast for him to order them into anything coherent. The overnight administrator, a man in his 40s who hadn't signed up for this when he'd taken the shift, looked at Emily with the expression of someone who has just been handed a variable he doesn't know how to account for. Diane looked at Emily. Her face did not perform anything. No visible relief, no theatrical recognition. Just a small, precise adjustment of posture, like a person who has been holding something heavy and can now fractionally redistribute the weight. "Dr. Satter," Emily said. She stopped 6 feet away. She put her hands in her pockets because she was very tired and because the gesture was one of composure rather than aggression, and she wanted that to be clear. "The patient in this room is not under your care." "I am the attending of record on this case," Satter said. His voice was steady, but had the specific tremor of controlled urgency underneath it. "You have no authority here." "You're right that I don't have institutional authority here," she said. "You're about to be arrested. The warrant was authorized in the last 2 hours, and federal agents are currently en route to this hospital." She held his gaze. "So the question isn't really about authority. The question is whether you want the last thing you do as a physician in this building to be forcing your way into an ICU room to access a patient you placed at risk yesterday." The corridor was very quiet. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Satter said. "I have 14 months of documentation about what I'm talking about," she said, "including your payment records from Meridian Health Solutions and the clinical deviations in your case history that I've been building since week 5. She paused. "Go home, Dr. Satter. Call your attorney, because the people who are coming here are not interested in talking." The second physician behind Satter had taken a half step back. The overnight administrator looked like a man searching for a surface to press himself against. Satter's hands, at his sides, were not entirely still. He looked at the ICU room door. He looked at Diane. He looked at Emily. And then, with the specific controlled motion of a man choosing which kind of damage to absorb, he turned and walked back down the corridor. The second physician went with him. Their footsteps were the only sound for a moment after they turned the corner. The overnight administrator said quietly, to no one in particular, "I need to make some calls." He followed them. Diane exhaled through her nose. One breath, slow, the way people exhale when they've been holding against pressure for 40 minutes, and the pressure has finally moved. She looked at Emily. "You look terrible," she said. "I've heard that. Are the agents actually coming?" "Yes, 20 minutes maybe." Diane nodded once. She looked at the ICU room door. She looked back at Emily. "The patient from yesterday's accident. She's doing better than they expected. Post-surgical, stable. Her daughter arrived an hour ago." Emily nodded. "The other one," Diane said. Her voice was flat in the way voices get flat, when the only alternative is something that isn't appropriate for a hospital corridor. "The one we lost yesterday." "I know," Emily said. "His name was Victor Parrish. He was 61. He had a daughter who drove 4 hours to get here after we called." She paused. "I need that to be in whatever record gets built. His name." "It will be," Emily said. "I'll make sure of it personally." Diane looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned back to the ICU room and straightened her shoulders and returned to being a charge nurse, which was what she was and what she would continue to be, regardless of everything that had happened in the last 23 hours. Emily stood in the corridor. From somewhere in the hospital, she could hear the sounds of the morning shift doing its work. The movement, the calls, the ordinary operational noise of a place that was still, despite everything, doing the thing it was supposed to do. Somewhere in the administrative wing, the overnight administrator was on the phone with people who were about to tell him things that would make his morning significantly more complicated. Somewhere in the parking lot, Satter was sitting in his car making a phone call to a lawyer who was about to deliver news he'd been insulated from for 14 months. And somewhere down the corridor behind her, she heard the doors open. The particular weighted sound of the exterior doors she'd been walked out of in handcuffs 23 hours ago, and the footsteps of multiple people entering the building with purpose. She turned around. The federal agents who walked through those doors were 3 in number. They were looking for Philip Satter. 2 of them moved toward the administrative wing with the particular efficiency of people who know what they're looking for and have the paperwork to get it. The third one stopped when he saw Emily. He was young, mid-20s, the kind of face that hadn't been carrying professional weight long enough to have it fully settled in. He looked at her standing in the corridor in the scrubs she'd been wearing since yesterday morning, and he said, "Are you Emily Carter?" "Yes." He nodded. He reached into his jacket and produced a document, a single folded page. "AUSA Forsyth asked me to deliver this to you personally." She took it, unfolded it. It was not an official document. It was a handwritten note on Forsyth's legal pad paper, the same paper Forsyth had been taking notes on all night. 4 lines, written in the fast, certain cursive of someone who'd made a decision they were confident in. "Emily, IG preliminary finding attached to the formal filing. Your record corrected, clarified, and commended. The patient's files go to independent review today. Vellum's suspension reversed effective this morning." One more thing. Voss's first call after the arrest was not to his attorney. It was to a number we hadn't seen before. "We're running it now. Don't go far." Emily read it twice. She folded it. She put it in her pocket. She looked down the corridor at the ICU room where Victor Parrish's name was going to be in the record because Diane had asked for it to be, at the ER around the corner where the morning was doing what mornings did in emergency departments, regardless of everything happening around them. At the exterior doors where the light was coming in clear and cold and completely indifferent to the weight of the night that had preceded it. She thought about Voss's first call after the arrest, not to an attorney, to an unknown number, which meant there was still a thread they hadn't found the end of, still a connection the network had built that the night's work hadn't reached. She pulled out her phone. She called Marsh. He answered on the second ring. "I know," he said. "Forsyth texted me. We're running the number." "Who does it go to?" A pause. In the background, she could hear the sounds of the federal operation continuing. Voices, movement, the ongoing machinery of an investigation that wasn't finished. We don't know yet, Marsh said. But Carter, he stopped. What? The number has a Colorado area code, and when we cross-referenced it with Lane's contact database, the one we pulled from his hotel room laptop, it appears in there. Once, 18 months ago, Lane made a call to it for 43 seconds. She held the phone. She looked at the light coming through the exterior doors. Where does it trace to? She said. Marsh was quiet for 3 seconds. When he answered, his voice had the particular quality she'd learned over the last 12 hours to associate with the moments when the investigation found something it hadn't been looking for. The number, he said, is registered to a medical foundation, nonprofit, registered in Colorado. The foundation's board chair is a physician. He paused. A physician who is currently the chief medical officer of Redstone Medical Center's parent hospital network. Emily turned slowly and looked at the hospital around her, the corridors, the staff moving through them, the building that had been her workplace for 11 weeks, and the site of an operation she'd thought she understood. What's the name? She said. Marsh told her, and the name was one she knew, not from her 11 weeks at Redstone, not from any document she'd built or financial record she'd traced, but from the original briefing at Fort Carson, from the 3-hour authorization session where the parameters of the assignment had been laid out, from the page of background material on Redstone Medical Center's institutional structure that she'd read and filed and not touched since. The name was on the original briefing document, the document that Marcus Lane had accessed, the document that had been compromised. She stood in the corridor of Redstone Medical Center with the morning light at her back, and she understood that the structure they'd dismantled overnight, the fraud network, the placed personnel, the corrupted oversight, the general who'd provided the federal ceiling, the part that had been built to survive. Emily stood in that corridor for exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds was what she allowed herself. To absorb the shape of it, to feel the specific cold weight of understanding that the network she'd spent 11 weeks mapping had a layer she hadn't touched, had been designed to have a layer she wouldn't touch, and that the person sitting at the center of that layer had been in the original briefing document the whole time, hidden not by concealment but by proximity. Sometimes the most protected position in a structure is the one that's visible from the beginning, the one that seems too obvious to be suspicious. Dr. Renata Sowell, Chief Medical Officer of Meridian Regional Health, the parent network that owned Redstone and 4 other hospitals across Colorado and Wyoming. Her name had been on page 3 of the Fort Carson briefing document under institutional hierarchy as a contextual reference. Not a subject, not a person of interest. Background, which was exactly where you wanted your name if you were running the structure that needed a background. Emily called Marsh back. How fast can Forsyth get a warrant for Sowell? She's already on it. She pulled the Foundation's 990 filings an hour ago, the nonprofit that Voss called. Sowell is listed as board chair, and the Foundation has dispersed grants to 2 of the same shell entities that fed the Meridian Health Solutions account. He paused. The Foundation looks legitimate on the surface. Healthcare research grants, community programming. The disbursements to the shell accounts were classified as administrative consulting fees. $700,000 over 3 years. That's the clean money, Emily said. The Foundation is how Sowell receives without touching the dirty accounts directly. Yes. Forsyth called it a receivership layer. The warrant language is being drafted now. Another pause, and in it she could hear Marsh moving. Footsteps. A door. Carter, Sowell is at the Meridian Regional Health Office building in downtown Ashford. She came in at 7:30. We have a federal agent on the building. She knows. Almost certainly. Voss's call to her number went to voicemail. She didn't pick up. But the fact that she went into the office this morning, rather than running, tells us something. Emily thought about that. A woman who'd built the outer layer of a network this carefully, who'd positioned herself as the legitimate face of an institution, who'd run a nonprofit as a financial cleanroom, who'd watched from the highest vantage point as every tier below her absorbed scrutiny and managed it, didn't walk into her office the morning the network collapsed because she'd panicked. She walked in because she'd calculated that being in her office, in her role, surrounded by her institutional identity, was better than the alternative. It was the wrong calculation. But it was a careful one, and that carefulness told Emily that Sowell was not going to be easy in the way that Quill had been easy, or even in the way that Lane had been easy. She was going to be the kind of difficult that required the evidence to be airtight before the conversation began, Because she would have an attorney in the room within 15 minutes of any approach, and that attorney would be good. The warrant needs to be complete before anyone goes near her, Emily said. Forsyth knows that. How long? She's estimating 45 minutes for the draft, another 20 for judicial review. Judge Alcott is already standing by. All right. Emily looked at the corridor, at the hospital around her. She was still standing 30 feet from an ICU room where a woman named Victor Parrish's daughter was sitting with the aftermath of something that had happened partly because of the structure Sowell had helped build and sustain. I'll be here. She put the phone in her pocket. She walked to the nurse's station at the ICU entrance. The nurse behind it, a young man named Ben who'd been at Redstone for 6 months and had developed the specific, efficient wariness of someone who'd learned that the ER and the ICU operated on different emotional frequencies, looked up when she arrived. Is the patient in Bay 3? The road accident from yesterday. Is her family with her? Her daughter's been here since 5, Ben said. Is the patient awake? In and out. She had a rough night, but the surgical team is cautiously optimistic. Emily nodded. If the daughter needs anything, food, a place to sit that isn't a hospital chair, can you make sure someone helps her find it? Ben looked at her. He was 24, maybe 25, and he was doing the thing young medical staff sometimes do when they encounter someone they can't categorize, trying to read seniority from posture rather than from a badge, and getting a mixed signal. Are you family? No, Emily said. I'm a nurse. She said it the way it was, so not with weight or irony, just as a statement of fact. And then she walked back toward the ER, because there was still a shift happening and there were still patients in it, and she had not yet handed off the 2 cases she'd been managing yesterday morning before the cruisers arrived. The warrant came through at 9:17. By then, Emily had given her handoff to the day charge nurse, a thorough, documented handoff, the kind that left nothing ambiguous, and had changed into clean scrubs from the locker room and had eaten something from the vending machine that she would not have chosen under any other circumstances, but that her body had decided was acceptable given the 25 hours it had been operating without fuel. Forsyth texted her when the warrant was signed. We're moving. Stay available. She stayed available. She sat in the break room with the vending machine food and a cup of coffee that was better than the situation warranted, and she waited. Around her, the day shift moved through its rhythms, and the news of what had happened, who had been arrested, what had been filed, what Redstone Medical Center's administrator and its governing body were now facing, was moving through the staff the way news moves through contained institutions, in fragments, with distortion, picked up and put down and reassembled imperfectly. She could hear it at the edges of conversations she wasn't part of. She didn't correct the distortions. The accurate version would be public soon enough. At 9:51, her phone buzzed. Marsh. We have Sowell, he said. She exhaled. How did it go? She had her attorney in the office before we arrived. Apparently someone in the building called her when the federal agents entered the lobby. A pause. She's not talking. The attorney invoked immediately, but she's in custody and the office is being secured. The foundation records. Physical and digital both. The foundation shares office space with Meridian Regional Health's compliance department, which is, as far as we can currently determine, either a remarkable coincidence or the most direct possible arrangement for managing both the legitimate and illegitimate financial flows from the same location. It's not a coincidence, Emily said. No, Marsh said, it is not. She set the coffee down. The filing? Forsyth is adding Sowell today? Sealed indictment. She'll be in the formal charging document by end of business. The others, Holt, Graves, Satter, Pritchard, Voss, those were filed at 9 a.m., as scheduled. It's public record now. Public record? Emily held that phrase for a moment. The thing about public record is that it doesn't only exist in the legal system. It exists in the world. Reporters covered federal indictments. Colleagues read them. Families read them. The people who'd watched her get handcuffed in the ambulance bay yesterday, the patients who'd been in that waiting room, the staff who'd looked away, they were all going to read the same document that put the context around what they'd witnessed. And the context was going to be comprehensive and documented and signed by a federal judge. She didn't find satisfaction in that the way she'd expected to. What she found was something quieter and less clean, The complicated recognition that the moment of institutional accountability, when it finally arrived, was less about the people being held accountable and more about the people who'd needed the accountability to happen. Vellum. The families of the patients Satter had managed badly. Gerald in Bay 9, who'd been frightened. The surgical team that had fought for the 42-year-old woman's life without knowing what was happening around them. The record was for them. The indictments were for them. The names on charging documents were for them. She picked up her coffee and went back to work. 3 weeks later, the federal courthouse in Denver was standing room by 8 in the morning. Emily didn't attend the arraignments. She'd been asked by a reporter from the Denver Post who'd called the number Forsyth's office had released for media inquiries, whether she planned to be present. She'd said no. The reporter had seemed surprised. Emily hadn't elaborated. She watched the news coverage that evening on a television in her apartment, the way anyone watches news. With a slightly removed quality, the screen making everything feel like it happened somewhere else. The footage of Holt being led into the courthouse steps had that specific visual grammar of institutional accountability. The suit, the lawyers flanking, the cameras. The moment when a person who has operated for years inside the invisibility of authority becomes suddenly, completely visible. Graves was 30 seconds later, smaller on screen than she'd expected, his face doing the thing faces do when they've run out of positions to take. Pritchard had the particular stricken quality of a public figure whose public identity has become the thing that damns him. All those speeches, all that accountability rhetoric, now part of the record in a way he hadn't intended. Voss appeared briefly on the federal courthouse steps in Breckenridge, not because the cameras could get a good angle on his actual arraignment, but because a photographer had caught him at the vehicle. He walked very straight, which she'd expected. The bearing had not gone anywhere. It didn't matter. The bearing was a performance, and performances didn't hold up in federal court. Satter's arraignment was not covered extensively because he was, in the hierarchy of the story as the press had constructed it, a mid-level figure, significant for the patient harm angle, which the Denver Post had covered in a separate piece that named Victor Parrish, and described the family's loss with the specific care that the situation required. Emily had read that piece. She'd read the paragraph about Parrish twice. She'd thought about Diane asking her to make sure his name was in the record. It was in the record. It was in the Post. It was now in the world. Lane's name appeared in a separate federal filing. The cooperation agreement meant his charges were structured differently, the public document more limited, the full scope under seal. His career in federal service was finished. That was certain. What the cooperation would ultimately produce for him was a question the next year would answer. Sowell's sealed indictment was unsealed 10 days after her arrest, when the forensic accounting on the Foundation's records had generated enough documentary evidence to make the sealed status unnecessary. The Foundation had been dissolved. Its grant recipients were under review. The compliance department that had shared its office space was being examined by an independent auditor appointed by the federal court. Meridian Regional Health, the parent network, the institution above the institution, had placed its board in emergency session and announced an independent governance review, which was the corporate equivalent of a person deciding to check whether the building they'd been living in was structurally sound after being told it might be on fire. The review was a necessary and insufficient response. Forsyth had made that clear in a press statement that used the word inadequate in a sentence about voluntary institutional review that Emily read 3 times because she respected the precision of it. Redstone Medical Center's internal administration was replaced within 2 weeks. The interim administrator was a woman brought in from outside the network who had a background in healthcare compliance and the specific quality of someone who'd been asked to do something difficult and had said yes without performing reluctance. Her first act was to authorize the independent medical review of every patient case flagged in Emily's evidence file. Her second act was to send a formal written communication to Margot Vellum. Vellum's suspension had been reversed within 24 hours of Forsyth's filing, per the cooperation agreement with Quill. The written communication from the interim administrator was not a legal document. It was a letter, 2 pages. It acknowledged what Vellum had done, what had been done to her in response, and what the institution owed her. It did not use the word sorry in a liability-managed way. It used it plainly. Emily read a copy of the letter because Vellum had sent it to her, along with a text message that said, "I don't know if you know how much this matters. I think you do. Thank you." Emily had looked at that text for a moment, sitting in her car outside Redstone before a shift. Then she'd put her phone in her pocket and gone in. Whoa. 6 weeks after the arraignments, Emily was called to a conference room she'd never been in, on the administrative floor of Redstone, which she'd passed many times but had no reason to enter during her working day. The interim administrator, whose name was Petra Holmgren, was there. So was a woman from the Army Medical Command whose rank Emily recognized and whose presence told her the meeting had been coordinated between the hospital and the military structure she still, in some technical sense, existed within. And Marsh. Marsh was there, which she hadn't expected, sitting in a chair with the relaxed posture of someone who'd been told to come and had found it convenient to do so. "Sit down, Emily," Holmgren said, which was the first time Holmgren had used her first name and suggested the meeting had a register different from administrative. She sat. What followed was 40 minutes. The Army's recognition of the embedded assignment's outcome. Formal language, official language, the kind that went into a permanent record and affected the nature of a person's institutional identity within the military structure. The commendation had already been drafted. The woman from Army Medical Command read relevant sections with the flat professionalism of someone who respected the document enough not to editorialize it. Emily listened. The language was accurate and specific and covered the parts it needed to cover, including the breach, including the conditions under which the assignment had been completed, including the patient care element that Emily had insisted, through Forsyth, be included in the official finding. Victor Parrish's name was in the commendation. She'd asked Forsyth to push for that. Forsyth had pushed. It was there. When the Army officer finished, Holmgren spoke. She described what Redstone Medical Center intended to do with its trauma training curriculum, an overhaul that had been in conversation for 2 years and had been blocked by Graves's office at every juncture. The new version would be built from the ground up with independent clinical oversight. The hospital wanted to name the program. Emily had been told this was coming. Marsh had given her a 30-second heads up in the parking lot before the meeting. She still felt the weight of it when Holmgren said the name. The Carter Trauma Training Program. She looked at the table. She was aware of her hands on the table surface, and she was aware that her face was doing something she hadn't entirely chosen for it to do. Not tears, not performance, just the small, involuntary shift of someone absorbing something larger than they'd prepared for. "I want to say something," she said. Holmgren stopped. "The name is... I appreciate it. I do." She looked up. "But the curriculum, when it's built, I want Margot Vellum's involvement in it. She identified the billing irregularity before I arrived. She was punished for it. The curriculum should include her name in its development history, not mine alone." Holmgren looked at her. "That can be arranged. And I want Diane Okafor's input on the nursing protocol section. She held that ICU door for 40 minutes against 2 physicians because she knew it was right. That's not a footnote. That's the program." Holmgren nodded. "Also, yes." The Army officer, who had been quietly observing this exchange, wrote something on her notepad. Marsh was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who is not going to show that they find a moment satisfying and is finding it very satisfying. After the meeting, Holmgren walked Emily to the door and stopped her with a hand on the arm. Not dramatically, just the way you stop someone when you have one more thing to say. "We've been authorized to offer you a leadership position," she said. "Nurse educator, full salary, administrative role, oversight of the new training program. It's a significant step." Emily looked at her. "Can I give you an answer in a few days?" "Of course." She went back to the ER. She worked the rest of her shift. She gave Holmgren her answer on a Thursday, in the same conference room, with considerably less ceremony than the first meeting. "I'm going to decline," she said. Holmgren had the expression of someone who'd half expected this. "The leadership role. Yes, I'll consult on the training program. I'll review the curriculum. I'll contribute to the protocol sections. I'll be available for questions. But I want to stay in the ER." "Why?" It wasn't a challenge. It was genuine. Emily thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest rather than just principled sounding. The principled sounding version was easy, something about the work mattering, about being where the need was. All of it true and also insufficient. "Because administrators make decisions about systems," she said. "And systems are important, But there's a person in Bay 4 right now who came in at 6 this morning and doesn't understand what's happening to them and is frightened in the specific way people are frightened when no one has taken 10 minutes to explain things in language they can actually understand. She paused. That's not a problem an administrator solves. That's a problem a nurse solves. And I'm better at it than most things I've ever done. Holmgren looked at her for a long moment. You could do more. At scale. I could do different, Emily said. I'm not sure it's more. She shook Holmgren's hand. She went back downstairs. She checked the board, took Bay 4, and spent the first 10 minutes of the encounter with the patient, a 70-year-old man named Artie, which was short for something he didn't offer and she didn't ask, explaining in clear, direct language what the tests were looking for and what the results so far suggested and what the plan was. Artie had the specific relief of someone who had been in a medical setting for 2 hours and had been spoken to around rather than two, and who had finally been handed the information in a form he could hold on to. Thank you, he said. It was simple. Of course, she said. That was the exchange. No ceremony, no wait. Just the ordinary transaction of one person having something another person needed and giving it without making them feel small for needing it. The federal trials began 14 months later. Emily testified in 3 of them. She was on the witness stand for a combined total of 11 hours across those 3 proceedings. And she answered every question with the same quality she'd brought to everything else, directly, accurately, without embellishment or evasion. Defense attorneys tried in the usual ways to create the impression that her embedded status made her evidence suspect, that the fact of her military background introduced bias, that the 11 weeks of careful documentation she'd built was the product of a predetermined conclusion rather than an observed reality. She answered each challenge the same way, with the document, with the timestamp, with the clinical record, with the financial trace, with the specific, verifiable, reproducible fact. The jury in Holt's trial deliberated for 9 hours. The verdict was what the evidence had always made it, which was inevitable, which meant it was satisfying in the way that things are satisfying when they arrive where they were always going to arrive. Holt, Graves, Pritchard, Voss, and Sowell were each convicted on multiple federal counts. Satter's trial was the longest. The defense worked hardest on the patient care charges, and the jury took longer, and when the verdict came in the courtroom, had the particular held breath quality of a room full of people who understand that the outcome matters past the room's walls. Satter was convicted on 8 counts, including 2 related to the deaths in his case file. Emily was not in the courtroom that day. She was in the ER, working a double because they were short-staffed, which they often were, and there was no version of her that was going to let a patient go uncovered because she wanted to watch a verdict. She found out the verdict in a text from Marsh, sent at 2:47 in the afternoon while she was between patients. She read it. She put the phone in her pocket. She went to the next patient. She told no one in the ER it wasn't their news to carry. It was hers, and she held it quietly through the rest of the shift. And when she got home that evening, she sat on her couch in the particular exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally, actually, set it down. Not because justice was complete. Justice is never entirely complete, because the gap between what is owed and what can be given back will not close all the way. Victor Parrish's daughter was still living with something that couldn't be undone. The 42-year-old woman who'd survived was living with the long aftermath of trauma. Vellum had gotten her record cleared, but the 4 months of suspension had happened, and the professional isolation of that period had happened, and the internal knowledge that she'd been right and been punished for being right had happened. And those things didn't disappear when a conviction came down. But the verdict meant the record was complete. It meant the formal account of what had occurred was accurate and public and carried the weight of federal law. It meant that every person who'd been harmed had, at minimum, the truth on their side, officially, inarguably, on the record, and that the people who'd caused the harm were answering for it in the way that the law could make them answer. That was not everything. It was not nothing. Emily had learned, in places that didn't appear on maps, that the difference between everything and nothing contains most of the meaningful territory in the world, that the partial outcome, the incomplete justice, the thing that is better but not fixed, that's where most of human experience actually lives. And the work of living in that territory, of doing what you can from where you are with what you have, is not a consolation prize. It's the whole job. She sat on the couch. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about the officer in the ambulance bay who'd told a crowd she was just a nurse. She thought about that phrase, the way he'd used it, the dismissal packed into a single word, the smallness he'd tried to assign to the work and to the person doing it. She'd heard variations of that assessment her entire career, in different registers. In combat zones where the medic was the second tier of the hierarchy, in hospitals where the physician was the sun and the nursing staff orbited it. She'd been underestimated in formal settings and informal ones, by people who knew her name and people who didn't. She had been told, in many different ways across many different years, that what she was less than what it was. And she had never needed the estimation to be accurate in order to do the work. That was the thing she kept coming back to, sitting in her apartment at the end of everything that had happened. The estimation had been wrong, flatly, demonstrably, expensively wrong, but the wrongness of it had never been what drove her. What drove her was the patient in front of her, Gerald, frightened about his tests. Artie, needing someone to explain things clearly. The 42-year-old woman in the ICU who was alive partly because someone had fought for her care. Victor Parrish, whose name was in the commendation, who mattered past his death, who had a daughter who drove 4 hours. That was the territory. That was the work. The recognition, when it came, was not nothing. The commendation, the program named in her honor, the verdicts, the public record. She was glad those things existed. She was glad Vellum's letter existed, and Parrish's name in the record existed, and the Carter Trauma Training Program, with Diane's protocols and Vellum's history, was going to exist. But she would have done it without any of those things. She had done it without any of those things, for 11 weeks, in a hospital where the institution around her had been constructed to bury what she was finding. She had done it without recognition because the recognition wasn't the reason. The person in the bed was the reason. The person in the bed was always the reason. She fell asleep on the couch, which was undignified and fine shuts. 3 months after the last verdict, on a Tuesday morning in what had become a routine shift, Emily clocked in at 6:42. She picked up the overnight handoff notes. She skimmed them standing up. She was halfway down the corridor toward Bay 4 before the charge nurse caught up to her. You know, the charge nurse, a newer hire named Luca, 27, still finding his rhythm, said, "You don't have to come in this early every shift." "I know," Emily said. "Most nurses don't." "I'm aware." He kept pace with her for a moment. He'd been at Redstone 4 months, which meant he'd arrived well after everything. After the arrests, after the administrative overhaul, after the new protocols, after the curriculum. He knew the broad contours of what had happened the way new staff know institutional history, in outline, filtered through other people's accounts, not lived. She was not a story to him. She was the nurse who came in 18 minutes early and moved through the department like someone who'd already mapped every contingency before she arrived. Bay 4 had a 60-year-old overnight sepsis case, Luca said. She's been asking a lot of questions, and the night crew ran out of time to answer them all. Emily nodded. She pushed through the bay curtain. The woman in the bed, 61 actually, according to the chart, the handoff notes had been rounded, looked up with the specific expression of someone who'd been waiting for a real answer for several hours and had stopped hoping it was coming soon. She had the kind of face that had spent time outdoors and showed it, and she was clearly someone who, under ordinary circumstances, ran her own situation. Being in a hospital bed, not running her situation, was costing her something. "I'm Emily," Emily said. "Tell me what they haven't answered yet." The woman looked at her for a moment. Then she started talking. Emily pulled the chair beside the bed. She sat down. She listened. She answered the questions one by one, in the order they were asked, in language that was plain and accurate and didn't condescend and didn't soften things into meaninglessness. She stayed until the questions were done. Then she stayed another 3 minutes, because the question that matters most is usually the one that comes after the questions a person thought they had. It did. She answered that one too. When she came out of the bay, Luca was at the nurse's station, watching her with an expression he probably didn't know was on his face. The expression of someone in the early part of their career who has just seen something done well and has filed it away without announcing that they've done so. She went to the next patient, and the one after that, and the one after that. This is what it looked like. This was what it had always looked like. Not the commendations or the verdicts or the moment the cuffs came off and the military vehicles sealed the block. Not the ceremony, not the recognition, not the validation that came from the world finally seeing what had been true the entire time. Those moments had their weight, and she didn't diminish them. But the weight that kept her here, that brought her back through the doors every morning 18 minutes early, was this. A person in a bed who needed someone to sit down, pay attention, and tell them the truth. You don't need a title for that. You don't need a commendation. You don't need anyone to acknowledge that what you do is harder and more necessary than the people dismissing it will ever understand. You just need to keep showing up, and she would.